especially during the pandemic. Currently, there are several big food delivery companies in China, and some of them use AI to accurately calculate the estimated time between the restaurant and customer destinations. By using big data, they gather information such as the most popular path that drivers will choose, the density of drivers at a given location, etc. This July, the company Meituan started deploying and testing AI-powered driverless food delivery vehicles in Wuhan as an experimental region. So my thesis aims to explore how the city will work when basic human labor such as food delivery is replaced by AI. I am interested in the architecture of total automation. In my project, I propose a mega building in the heart of Shenzhen. The project center is under design for an AI-powered building that is farming self-sufficient for the delivery robots and the food delivery system in the city. The project also speculates some possible effects brought by this new architecture of total automation on significant urban conditions. MVRDV once came up with an idea called SCI-Car City, compared with driving on the ground. They develop air as a new traffic system. So they lift the building generating the bridge and platform to let vehicles attached to them. Finally, they develop a very complicated multiple traffic system. They design flying vehicles as a first step, then develop the tunnel in the whole city. I was interested in researching robots and speculating on what kind of new delivery robots could there be in the building. I was looking at several types of robots, humanoid robots, animal types, and transformation types. And I also designed my own robots, a modular system of boxes and attachments that could autonomously move through the building and into the city. Because the building also contains a self-sufficient farming program, it requires agriculture and storage. So I look into the size of the warehouse, all of them are quite large. I also look into agriculture for different types of crops. The greenhouse become a crucial component in my project since all the crops will be grown in the project, which requires me to divide the agriculture area into two different parts, open space agriculture area and greenhouse area. I chose Shenzhen as my site. The reason I chose it is, according to the big data from Meituan, Shenzhen is the top 1 food delivery city which 12% of orders in the whole China. The number of overall orders in Shenzhen within 1 month is 35 million, which is 1.167 million per day. I also roughly calculated the orders in my site according to the ratio of area, 23:1007.75 square meters. So that is 15,404 orders per day on my site. This is a mapping shows all the restaurants locations in Shenzhen. Those red marks represent the location of restaurants. Blue marks represent the place where I will put my project on it in an urban scale way. The service range of my project is from 1 to 2 blocks. Green marks are the robots detached from my projects and land on prefabricated structures to form a certain function for the city. From researching the MVRDV SCI-Car City project, I learned that robots can be dynamically attached and detached from the building, on a basis of need. So the base of the whole project is a very tall vertical robot's core. Then several fragmentary pieces and planes will be inserted into the core. Those planes will divide the core into 4 main areas: facility area, warehouse area, agriculture area, and delivery area. All of them are connected by several elevators inside the core. This is the basic area that keeps the project running normally. Ingredient materials will be transformed here. Then it will be divided into several categories and transformed into different warehouses. There also will be a farm market to sell goods to humans. Every box here is movable. 2 boxes can merge into 1 big box according to the preset trail if large size storage is needed. They can also be separated into 2 boxes and transform stuff from this box to other areas. The platform itself is an open space agriculture area, and all those boxes are greenhouse areas. Livestocks are raised in the core of the building, and we can recycle their waste as fertilizer for crops. This is the platform where robots gather and fly out to other buildings. The program on top of the core is a water collection and water recycle filter. The containers that robots live in can not only be attached to the facade of the building. It can also form a containers group as a landscape to create leisure for people. And they can also stand by to reach other buildings.
So Ryan, did you finish the presentation? Okay. So we can open up for the questions. Yeah.
Food delivery men are a crucial part of the city.
So sorry, one logistical question, Ryan, right away. So the facility that you end up designing, it's the storage and distribution center, but it's not the agriculture itself. Is that correct? You're muted.
Oh, you're muted.
Oh,
Can't hear you.
can you hear me right now?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So this building is like the combination of the self-sufficient farming and also the food delivery man. It starts from the food delivery, and because I try to do like the fully automation city, fully automation building, so it also needs farming to grow crops and the livestock in the building. So it's a kind of like the combination for the whole food delivery system, from the growing food and to the delivered to them.
Mm-hmm.
What having made this huge tower and done all these kind of really interesting explorations, I guess I was interested at the start of your presentation. You talk about how this study would kind of lead you to new conclusions about the effect that AI is going to have on certain types of labor, and I was wondering what your conclusion was, because to me there's this kind of interesting question of what happens not only to the delivery people but also all the people that run all the restaurants that are connected to those deliveries. And by centralizing this and automating it, what do you think would be the kind of urban, you know, the situation created by such a building being present in the city? Do you see it as positive or like a negative, but somehow a kind of logical conclusion of some type of logic, the logic of, you know, the giant sort of non-human buildings that you've referenced, taken to its kind of ultimate conclusion? Is the project a critique, or is it a kind of a sort of earnest proposal?
I think I might mistakenly mute myself at the beginning. The project is based on what I observed from my city, because when the pandemic just happened, China went through a very hard time. Like everybody had to stay at home, and at that time only the food delivery men, they can like reach to the others. And so I was thinking, like, if this kind of like such catastrophe happen again, what should we do to prevent such a thing happen? So I think the automation city can be a solution. So I cannot really tell, is this like dystopian or utopian, because I'm trying to like provide the possible future scene for the city when the economy grows, and also like the people are replaced by the AI. it's hard to, for me, it's hard to define it's a dystopian or utopian.
Maybe you can, I mean, I think that's a really, good question. And I'm wondering if you could talk more about your position in regards to what you consider now ground. What is the ground in your project, in your city, and how how your building itself not only kind of meets the ground, but the ground accommodates the building, or what happens itself, and what do you imagine the kind of urbanism around your building? What is it like?
I think I introduce like how the building is formed, like the container attached to the facade. So this is just one example. So I think in the future for the surrounding, I think like the robots can also attach to the other building. So
I guess in one way, I mean, do you still, in a simple way, do you imagine the city to be in any way pedestrian, right? Or are there a kind of condition, are you rethinking what street is, for example, or what the context for which a building rises is, so in a way, redefine context, right? Does it then change the way and alter the way that sites around it would form in the near future and future? In a way, right? Is this a kind of future vision for which maybe the street, in your opinion, is no longer the way we understand street, et cetera? So that's what I'm kind of curious about as well, right? And you're thinking about it.
Maybe just a comment, and maybe this is just an open question to Jeffrey's question. I was also wondering, like, you have a vertical city, right? Which probably I'm assuming, or I hope that is based on the research as well. I mean, I was wondering why not distributing it horizontally, on top of existing buildings, for example, to actually really foster this layering of city and transportation on different levels. But this being said, I think Amazon was the last. I think they had they submitted drawings for patents of these different towers for drones, which I think I don't know if you looked at that, but I think yours I think pushes that way further. I mean, that was 2017. None of these were really built, but I think it's interesting to go vertical nevertheless, because there are some I think less advanced maybe presidents already.
Yeah, it's interesting in some ways, although you say you don't understand it as either utopian or dystopian. To me, I read it as a kind of post-apocalyptic project, and maybe we've already experienced a light apocalypse. And for me, I tie it back to the kind of metabolist movement, or maybe some of Isasaki's experiments with cities in the air in relationship to an understanding of a kind of the wasted city, or the city torn by war, or kind of nuclear apocalypse. And so, I mean, and I read it in that way, both in terms of its verticality and also in terms of its kind of pixelization, or the kind of capsulization of the project. So, and I wonder if you can talk about your work in relationship to some of that Japanese work, maybe firstly, and then secondly, I wonder about the role of the pixel in the work. You refer to it as the container, but I wonder about it architecturally, functionally, but also aesthetically. It's obviously presenting itself kind of imagistically in a very strong way.
So the like those boxes, like the pixelated, it's like actually it's for the it's not only as a like warehouse or agriculture space, and also those pop-out space can like let robots stay inside and to move with it. And also I think also like in the it can be a very like not only just for the warehouse or agriculture, it can also be like, as I mentioned, it's just here it's like you can fly out to form some other facility in the building in the city, and also they can form like the landscape to create a leisure for people and to stand by to for other purpose use.
I mean, I think.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Alicia.
No,
you're the guest.
Sorry. I think that, I'd like to clarify some of the terminology, because I think, Ryan, you've talked about, like, I was really intrigued by when you said to reach other buildings. And so I wanted to ask you kind of how do you distinguish between what is a building set within an urban context, right? And to kind of really examine some of those terms. And then I think that there's something about what you're working with that really belies kind of a questioning of what is a building, what is the urban, what is a system, and how, and I would think that you think of pixel, you might think of voxel, like you're thinking dimensionally, and how all these systems that are both that which we can see that's material, and that which is invisible in terms of command and all sorts of other waves. And think of the project in like right now, to think of it in those terms, like what is a building? How do we can't, I think in your terms, cannot assume that we know what that is in the way that it's been known before. So I would really urge you to think through that, like, and even now here, in the time that you have to present the project, like, what does it have to do with scale? Does it have to do with identity? Does it have to do with boundary? Certain modes like that. And when does it become a system? So I think that Darren pointing to Isozaki, or thinking like through the earlier metabolist work, it very much was thinking of this kind of continuity between the biological, the cybernetic, right, the information, material, and what those systems are. And then kind of what becomes the discrete consumer object, right, out of that then is what's transported and moved. So I think that it has, kind of all these multiple iterations. And, I'm primarily a writer, so those are the kind of questions that I would search for in terms of how you kind of match your theory and the way you're speaking of the project against what we're seeing here, and augmenting your narrative.
I think
more a comment, but
no, I think Alicia and Darren asked super important questions, Ryan. I think in my opinion, there kind of has to be a distinction between what is the architecture, and that's up for grabs in this situation, right? Like, could be a network of flows, could be a framework, could be different sets of grounds, could be just simply the infrastructure that holds the stuff, right? That holds all the stuff that you have to store, produce, and distribute here. And I do have to say that's not clear. Maybe for the advantage of the project at this moment, that stuff is not clear, right? You can't really divorce the what's really a building or something that's permanent there, and what's like movable, what's to be delivered, what's even a vehicle, right? It's all, I think, on purpose being reduced. It's been reduced to, as you said, like a system of boxes, a system of very generic parts that either pose as stuff, pose as vehicles, or pose as architecture, but they all look alike in a way. And I think that looking back at the work of the metabolists, the way I see at least the problem, there are two kinds of work that one could loosely detect there. The one which I will find the example more in the proposal for the Tokyo Bay proposal by Tange, there is the architecture works at the level of the system of flows that has been kind of architecturalized into a number of levels that crisscross, produce different kinds of knots and so forth. But you can see that there's an architect behind thinking about that. That it's not just an engineering point of view, right? And then there is attached to that framework, attached to that infrastructure, there's a system of growth of things that begin to populate, and they've been rendered over time in a scenario that starts from nearly empty to almost full in a way, right? So you could say that there is somehow a kind of holistic approach that conquers everything, and then the kind of architecture begins to grow within in a way, right? So there's something holistic, and then there's still a system of parts. There are other metabolic projects in which the bottom-up approach takes on, right? Takes over the project, and you can see that growth and whole terms are kind of up for grabs, right? So I'm curious in your project, right? Like another approach could have been say, okay, I'm going to design a big storage container, and I'm going to be the author of that, or whoever designs that. And then all the stuff populating within is going to fill in or more, depending on the epoch, right? Could be more or less empty or more or less full in a way. But the extension of it could be a given, right? So and I think those signals to me different kinds of architects, right? Like, where do you want to take authorship? Do you want to take authorship on the kind of hardware, on the stuff that remains here? Or do you want to take authorship in the logistics of how this stuff is transient from point A to point B and point C in a way, right? So that diagram from MVRDV that you materialize into a system of network, that is all the, the work behind the scenes, right? It's not stuff that really gets manifested into physical networks or anything like that. It's just, past their, speculation diagrams and so forth. So to me, it kind of goes down to like, on which architect do you want to be? Do you want to be behind all those networks? Do you want to be on the kind of programming end? Or do you want to design the physical stuff that perhaps at one day we have to accept that it will become obsolete, right? And won't be rendered as usable as it might be in the current time when that thing is designed.
I wonder, Maxi and Alicia, have been haunted by, I think you said, not a revision of narrative, but a kind of reimagining of narrative was the last thing you said, and it's been on my mind since that this is a project with a strong scenario basis. You wouldn't get here without the reading you've made of the existing ground plane delivery system that made life barely possible through Shenzhen and in this last period, and what you imagine. And I do think this is like a modest proposal in the Swiftian sense of a proposal that so radically inverts all the logic of your initial storyline that it becomes incredibly gargantuan. By pulling the riders and the ground plane out of the scenario, by saying, when I imagine a future in which that role is robotized and aerial. And if that's the case, then architecturally the challenge becomes one of surface maximization. Surface maximization for the storage of those vehicles in a vertical extrusion, and surface maximization for growth areas, enclosed or not, on your intervening planes. And my first thought in looking at it was just architecturally, you might be more rigorous about the forces coming to bear in those two ways. You could say, like, if there are going to be flight paths for all of these delivery drones, those flight paths matter, and they wouldn't simply swarm like bees. You'd probably have to, like MVRDV, you'd have to think through some of those pathways. And I have a feeling different sides of your totem would reflect different paths of departure and arrival. And anyway, that, like, I just think that could have given you a way to kind of nuance the architectural argument for how the aerial vehicles are coming and going. And in a similar way, I think the planes, the growth and storage planes, and all the accretion that happens between the planar and the columnar in your scheme, could have probably played a little bit more with sun angles. And as I thought about it, you're pretty equatorial, so it doesn't give you a really, Shenzhen doesn't give you a really easy bias. But if you were a little further off the equator, I'd be asking you why they aren't elliptical and favoring south or north exposure in a more obvious way. I think the simple question here is, why are they square, not circular? Because cantilevering out to those square corners is harder. So I feel like if you want to take the kind of the quasi-science of your argument further, I think there could have been there's some interesting architectural consequences that could, there's still some room to grow there, so to speak. But just getting back to the bigger picture, I find it really interesting that you've spent the semester understanding that this hovers ambiguously between utopian and dystopian speculation, and that you've allowed it to play out within that scope of ambiguity. I actually think you're operating in a rather unprecedented kind of conceptual space and taking it on with, allowing that neutrality, or that I don't want to call it indecision, but that kind of simultaneity to persist. And I think in doing so, you are kind of operating in present circumstances in a pretty admirable. These are difficult times, and I think you've stepped up to those difficulties in an impressive way.
Yeah, I think for me, coming back to my earlier question, I think one of the things that's really interesting about this project is essentially making networks visible, because things like food delivery now has become so kind of ubiquitous, but it's so contained within the realm of the smartphone. And I think in a way, I don't know what it's like in China, but certainly in Britain at least, food delivery is a really precarious. It's a really precarious job to have. It doesn't pay very well. You've got no legal, workers' rights and protections. At the same time, if you go down certain streets, you see hundreds of scooters lined up because everyone's just waiting outside the restaurants. And it actually quite changes a lot of public spaces in the city, because now you have lots of people waiting by restaurants to deliver food in spaces that weren't really designed for that. So it's kind of interesting. You can see little moments like that in cities, but instead I think it's been discussed, you kind of twist this on its head and turn it into this big kind of totem. And I think there's something quite interesting about making that move, because a lot of the sort of non-human architecture that you've referenced, we don't really come into contact with as people, in our everyday, yet it's so kind of pervasive in facilitating our modern lives. So I think it's a really kind of interesting, it's bombastic, but critically so, I think, to make something that's so kind of large and overbearing on the city that maybe makes us confront our reliance on these networks and all the people that do the jobs that we don't want to do, that make our modern life easier. So I think in that regard, for me, I think there's something really powerful there. I guess just as it was on the metabolist comments as well, just for fun, it might be interesting to look at the robots that Isazaki designed for Expo 67, because there's this kind of really playful counterpoint to the sort of more serious sort of systems-based work that they did, where I don't think they actually worked properly in the end. I'm not sure if they were actually activated in Expo 67, but he designed all these kind of weird sort of anthropomorphic giant sort of house-sized robots that would do this kind of little dance and choreography. And I think it was it Kurokawa wrote about the relationship between robots in Japanese culture and robots in Western culture, and how it comes out of the history of puppets and things like that. And this sense that the robots have a kind of characteristic quality to them as well, which I think you get a kind of sense of in some of your in some of your visualizations here. But for me, it'd also be really fascinating what I think as the point earlier about the aerial. What would it be like to live with these things dropping from the air like every 20 seconds to deliver something to someone else? Would it become maddeningly infuriating because you can't walk through a city and sort of look at the clouds anymore without this thing flying past your head? Again, it's kind of fascinating to bring that kind of network out and expose it to scrutiny in that way.
think if there's a pause to open things up a little more broadly, this is a very interesting project to be looking at today, or the day before tomorrow, which is the 20th anniversary of 9/11. If you're driving around Los Angeles these days, all you hear, or actually I imagine it's today our traditional media are completely dominated by these 20-year remembrances of 9/11. And I was looking at your tower, especially that sequence where the planes slice into your tower, and it was hard to avoid the kind of recombinance with that event. But I actually really do and again, I feel like it's this sort of odd double-edged invocation of that. But the degree to which I think the tall building as an architectural challenge was changed fundamentally 20 years ago. And I think, a lot of these last 20 years have gone to building an enormous array of them and wondering why we bothered to. And I think your project actually elucidates that dilemma in a really compelling way.
Yeah, and Joe, those are great points. And I'm just thinking, sorry, Ryan, back to when you talked about there was these kind of objects would kind of go and reach other buildings. It seemed to me, right, that moment of your video, that this would start to be like thinking of an urbanism that was highly dense and there was mobility as some kind of futurism. But like, I think that most of what we're seeing in the presentation is that individual tower, right, that's fairly symmetrical around its central axis, and we don't know kind of what that brings in together. And so, like, if I go back to Joe's point about the anniversary tomorrow, and I'm sitting in New York right now, and just thinking about the isolation of those two towers, as standing out among others, and just wondering if there's something of a different kind of resiliency you might posit, or something about a field condition that ends up being kind of deeply dimensional, but in a vertical way, so that I think the project could use that speculation of what that is. And going back to Luke's kind of discussion back to Isesaki and the idea of the robot and the augmentation, right? Like looking at the late 60s, into the mid to late 60s of kind of investigations, it brings in also kind of other questions about kind of the politic, the material that might really kind of bring to bear on the project in today's world. And you are poised, you are completely right thinking about everything that the world we've gone through in different parts of the world in the last 18 months, unprecedented times, of what that is. So this idea of these systems, I think, is a really great intuition, and just to not hold back and to kind of just take it to this other level of speculation where you're not necessarily kind of trying to present it here as a kind of a final that's really a beginning, a commencement that's really about the next beginning, but move quickly, don't think about rendering, think about what the implications of this might be in other conditions where you're not kind of bogged down by how do you represent this, how do you work the video, and I would use this kind of discussion very much to break that open in terms of how you're theorizing the project.
Yeah, I think.
No. So, Damien, sorry. It's even in this view, it's very solitary, right? And so I wonder what that implication. So I'm still tying to something that you said, Ryan, through your presentation. So, pardon for the clarification.
Yeah, I think Ryan also had an idea to kind of multiply these towers everywhere in Shenzhen and kind of cover the city with these. But I think in general, I think what is maybe what was motivating the project from my point of view is really this desire to kind of visualize kind of a post-human building in the city, like a massive monolith. This is really, I think, the horizon of Ryan's interest as far as I understood the project. And I think all the other considerations are, were kind of secondary to this idea. And I'm guessing we'll see a lot of projects also today, which are made in this moment of crisis. I really like also the comparison with the metabolist idea, which was kind of a response to a particular crisis of that time. So I think this is one of the really, I think Ryan's attempt to kind of come to terms with the condition of living in the city right now, and kind of looking at, we looked at this research that considering Meituan and other companies and the kind of unbearable urban conditions that are produced by delivery companies and kind of like almost dangerous living through this kind of automation and through apps. So it was interesting to see that kind of transformation into this, kind of Death Star-like object. But it's really, I think the main motivation is really kind of a desire to see an image of a building rather than to kind of work out the details, which I think the conversation kind of points to. I think Ryan, less maybe fascination with the visual kind of component and the sublime, the kind of component would be, it would be more interesting to maybe develop scenarios of how these things would be if they were. I think it's a really interesting effort. So congratulate you on the work. So if anyone had any last thoughts or questions, otherwise.
Yeah, I would just like to follow up really quickly on what you just said. I mean, I think that's really admirable in the sense that you're not ending up in this like, and I would really recommend if you haven't seen them yet, but the Amazon, the towers for drones, to look at those, how, I mean, I don't know, patent drawings are usually one-liners anyways, unless they're constructional techniques. But I think I do think that that's really admirable in your project, that in a way you're overcoming this notion of really the one-liner, in that sense that it's very literal to maybe specific functions. This being said, I mean, I would still be interested in maybe just zoom-ins of how that works, not having so much experience with robots and what's out there. Like maybe there are scenarios that you could even play through, that are more specific to maybe your building parts or so. I would be interested in that. But or the other thing would be to just check how or see how a building or your proposal will be shaped in a different city, and how that logistical knowledge would play out itself, or would it look exactly the same? That's something that I would also be really excited about. And I'm just saying that because I think thesis projects are always so exciting, because it's just the beginning of something very big, and something I would encourage to continue the offers to investigate in, because usually they're really fantastic proposals.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.
And our next student is Shui Ma.
Oh, yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Troy, and my presentation will also be basically on the video. And if there are no sound, please notice me, and I will share my screen now.
Tracing back to the contradictory history of suburb development, people from rural areas seemingly profit less from the process of infrastructure advancement accompanied by the technological renewal, causing a gap between the suburbia and cities. It leads to the phenomenon that people used to consider suburbia as a dystopian, isolated place. Hyperloop is a developing high-speed mass transportation system for both passenger and freight transport, which was first proposed by Elon Musk. Hyperloop is described as a sealed tube or system of tubes with low air pressure through which a pod may travel substantially free of air resistance or friction. The Hyperloop could potentially move people or objects at airline speeds. With the revolution of transportation and related infrastructure, it will be imperative for architects, urban designers, and infrastructure engineers to rethink how to make futuristic community environment at suburbia run parallel with the related changes of infrastructure and technology in 50 years. Hyperloop Suburbia presents a vision of futuristic residential living of transit-oriented community by world simulation and architectural interface. I explore how future infrastructure systems will impact the suburb environment, including patterns of streets, infrastructure improvements, and housing strategy. Made as a pilot project to imagine rural housing development around Hyperloop, this new system is located in the central area of Sherman Oaks, Los Angeles, which will be an important suburb transport hub in the future, according to Elon Musk's proposed route plan of California. The concept of solarpunk is similar to cyberpunk, with a focus on technology. However, solarpunk offers a version of the future where communities are powered by renewable energy and most people live in a free and egalitarian world. Both ideas of the future focus on mankind and the use of technology, but rarely in our media do we see our future from a more positive, sustainable perspective. I'd like to consider the idea of what a solarpunk future looks like and consider communities on how we get there as a society. As we know, the definition of prefab architecture under prefabrication technology, the construction should be fast, cost-effective, and changeable over time. And we can imagine it could be strongly possible to offer a democratic alternative for community displacement in the suburbia future. That prompted me to imagine a world where all the elements are prefabricated, including residence units, infrastructure system, amenities, greening parts, and even ground, which is called tray landscape. In this futuristic suburban world, all the different elements will be placed and inserted on the corresponding sockets of prefabricated tray-like ground. Specifically, this project presents a prototype of a neighborhood which is a high-tech oriented and relatively low-cost prefabricated community system for the suburbia of Sherman Oaks. Tray landscape will provide a highly tech-oriented community system and naturally growing nature in suburbia. With the Hyperloop system opening as the city's main means of transportation and infrastructure improvement, the main boulevard will be the only traditional roadway to be retained. Cars will be replaced by Hyperloop pods and automated vehicles. That means within the community, the internal road network will disappear. The space between residencies and other units will need to be reconstructed. In the next era of Hyperloop transportation, pods play the role of the passenger's environment of round trip between downtown and suburbia, and this kind of transportation-oriented space will also represent a kind of new lifestyle in architectural and urban aspects. Within the new community, the basic shape of prefab housing units are designed as highly customized shared pods. The volume, materials, and space of these units could be customized and changeable. Underneath these pods, there will be a new prefabricated infrastructure installed at ground level. The new ground of suburbia will be constituted by essential structure foundation and infrastructure, which means the prefabricated housing components could be arranged on the tray landscape automatically and rapidly. That would visibly change suburb patterns of streets and the infrastructure system of residents. Beyond these imagination and proposals, I also thought about how to use the built and simulated environment as part of the interaction interface. One approach for working at the intersection of architecture and interaction interface is to think about how to overlay information, interactivity onto the simulated environment of the future. This project focuses not only on the development of a digital platform or digital service, but also on how the interactive world will work as an architectural element in the built and simulated environment. Hyperloop Suburbia offers a public platform and interface for a significant conversation between architects, urban planners, and technologists to engage with each other and the community early on in the development cycle. In this virtual world, designers and users could interact with the information of the neighborhood and each prefab unit from God view, housing dynamic view, and third-person view. This community interface is an opportunity to view our futuristic and virtual world as a single reality that allows humankind to progress with the new virtual platform at its maximum potential. The new Suburbia system simulation will be an incremental regional model that can be flexibly integrated into the environmental fabric of existing and new regional contexts. It's possible to provide new prototypes to develop aesthetically delightful, transit-driven, pluralist communities across different rural areas.
Generally, I utilize the game platform to create a virtual architectural kit or playful community to represent a kind of suburb area utopia, which is highly tech-oriented and relatively ecological and natural living environment under the improvement of the means of vehicles and the infrastructure to construct this kind of utopian world in the future. Okay, I will keep looping my video during the later discussion. Thank you.
Sure. It's really interesting premise. I'm wondering, like, if you thought about how within the tray, within the system, as a kind of what you're proposing as a kind of prototype, how do you consider, both the idea of sort of private ownership and parcelization, or like a plot, versus the kind of communal living? I mean, is that something you've thought about in terms of like how you define the block itself? Is it something that is, built by a single entity and then it's more communal, or is it about what is traditionally in America, at least in America, the idea of a private ownership and a kind of parcelization of territory? So I'm just wondering, like, in a way, did you think about that? And then if so, how is that kind of reflected in the overall proposition?
Oh yes, in my aggregation, in my thoughts, in the like single communities, like the ground is prefabricated units, previously divided by the designers and like first floors and base like public floors could be also designed by the different requirements, but support by private like owners could be highly customized, like in this virtual platform or other like tools by these owners, and stacking and growing this prefabricated base, and this like single building could growing by the requirements of the owners, and public also growing from this background, I think. Yeah.
I was going to ask if you could, if I kind of understood correctly, you've got this suburban development, and you've got, I guess, what might essentially be like a digital twin of that development that's also located within an interactive game environment. And so I guess I was interested if you could speak a bit more maybe about what type of decisions or what type of kind of communal relations would the game environment generate, do you think, and what would its kind of role be in terms of, I guess, fostering some kind of communal sense to this suburban development?
I thought like also like this prefabricated system also includes the public space between the different buildings and also in the single buildings. So I think also most of the public space could also be like ordered or decided by the residents or owners. So it also can construct a utopian futuristic communities lifestyle. And so yeah, yeah, beyond Hyperloop, so Hyperloop also has a idea of the shared space in the vehicles or ports that it's continuous in the transportation. So I want to also derive and continue this lifestyle also in the living environments around the Hyperloop roads. So make a new quick and for the nomad workers in Los Angeles for the suburb life.
It's a fascinating proposal. There's a lot to kind of talk about from the notion of the Hyperloop and the potential impacts or plausibility and its relation to suburbia. Like, I think you're posing a lot of really compelling questions, and in many ways the proposal is very future forward in terms of design and formation and relationship to community, et cetera. But I guess I would challenge you on the notion of prefabrication, and maybe that it might be an area where you might begin to kind of rethink how things are made in relationship to current technology. If it's the part of your project that feels anachronistic, if you think about like Habitat 67 by Moshe Safdie, and the kind of prefabricated stacked units that are, housing for the people, now luxury apartments, or Nakagan Capsule Tower, which is being demolished. Like, I would just wonder if prefabrication is still the answer to the same question that we've been asking for 100+ years. I wonder if they're in relationship to technology and some of the other things that are brought up in the previous project. I wonder if you might be able to kind of rethink how things are made and deployed as well. Maybe it's too much to ask, but so what it makes me think about.
It's a very strange proposal for Thousand Oaks, which I drove through yesterday. And I like this. I like the strangeness of it. It's like, I was thinking this could be kind of, Kim Kardashian's real estate venture in 10 or 20 years down the street. I do, and Darren's questions about prefabrication, I think, are interesting and worth thinking about. I think they'd tie into a logic of delivery. If the dwellings are going to be pre-stressed and pre-poured concrete, the way they find their way to this site and towards one another, I think, becomes important. But I kind of want to take you on in terms of your scenography as much as the kind of building logic of it. The term solar punk reminds me of another construction of maybe 10 years ago, Normcore, which was used to describe films, actually a lot of like very, very small budget New York films made about people's very, very, very everyday lives. And the idea that there was something transgressive in looking at the simple and normal, that the normal and transgressive could cohabit, seems as complicated an idea as combining solar and the sensibilities of solar energy delivery and a faith actually in systems and scientific positivism, with punk rock and a even more exacting faith in the power of destruction and ripping things up to make them new again. And I actually, I'm glad you got intrigued with it, and it's interesting to me to see where it went. What's striking to me is what it's delivered as this kind of odd romantic landscape. And what your scheme reminds me of most actually is a sort of super scaled funereal landscape. Almost, like the houses look almost more like sarcophagi that have been overgrown by this kind of miraculous tropical fauna that's hard to imagine. I would be so thrilled if solar power and its related technologies can deliver anything like that lush landscape in that location. But just the different dimensions of conjecture in this project are really interesting. And I don't think my first thought honestly was your project reminds me of the film Her. I don't know if you saw that a few years ago. Should we? It's worth, if you haven't, find it. It actually holds up pretty well. But it was remarkable at the time for combining the actual landscapes of Los Angeles and Shanghai to imagine LA's future. And what I see in your project is a kind of analogous operation that would be more a combination with Singapore, and the idea of a kind of more of that kind of actually the considerable low-rise tropical logic of Singapore transposed to kind of outer borough LA. And it's remarkable, but that view is right out of like a 19th century British romantic watercolorists way of imagining a future in which nature reclaims the man-made.
Yeah, I mean,
maybe just, oh, go ahead, Maxi.
I was just thinking that, I mean, you're exactly on this slide that your project has 4 different kinds of contributions to the problem of this, if you want, I don't know, communal living. And I'm wondering if in my opinion, I find the major contribution being that ground, that kind of motherboard, circuit board in which different structures get situated, and the kind of playful, mentality that triggers in that plane is almost a little bit. It's actually like a playground in a way. I find the approach to prefabrication still kind of nostalgically attached to the kind of 60s prefabrication, which is the idea of the kind of sufficient pod and or capsule, the kind of formalism and the rounded edges and the kind of self-involved bubble, to me kind of points in that direction in a way. And I'm curious though, if for a project so focused on networks and connectivity and so forth, if prefabrication could be redirected towards larger systems, right? Still, perhaps the question there is, can there be an identity piece out of that? Can there be a formal project that comes out of that in a way, right? But a project that perhaps produces a little bit more of an emphasis on density and a kind of communal living that perhaps the horizontal ground wouldn't be just the only example of a playful recombination of communal living, and where prefabrication begins to work at a more, at that kind of community, right? Like begin to work at that level of the community and not reinforce individual notions of living and private life.
Yeah, I might jump in. I know, Nicole, you were starting to speak before, but the comment I was going to make actually connects to Maxi's comment. And I think the question here for me is an idea about, what is urbanism, or what are areas that should be connected by the Hyperloop. And I think in this way of like looking back to the 60s of these utopian projects, what struck me, even some of the visuals of the project, was tying back to, let's say, Andrea Branzi, who then kind of worked with Gianni Vattimo, and Vattimo would talk about a kind of pensiero debole, a weak thought, and as a way of kind of like breaking through kind of larger structures of structuralism and post-structuralism, and how this idea of weak thought became an idea of weak modernity, or the idea of the diffuse city. And then I think some of the projects also of Branzi, where he's kind of looking back to some of the work that he had done with Arcazum in the 70s, brings that forward. And I think it's called, I'm trying to look it up, the Agronica So it's the, you know, in and looking at it 2010. So it's already some time ago, but an idea of, you know, what that means if, and actually I think, and then taking something, Agronica of Branzi from 10 years ago, and thinking that through some of the theories of the commons at this point, or community land trust, I think that would be interesting to kind of layer that in this project and understand kind of what is the land on which you build. Is there productivity? Is there, you know, what is the status vis-a-vis, you know, what constitutes urbanism? So it's kind of my question in the last project, like, what is the building? You know, here we start to question what's the field, what's urbanism, what's the individual, what's productive, what's not, what's extractive, and all of those kinds of questions that I think would be really kind of interesting. You know, if one thinks of the you know, what connects what, like if we're moving from, you know, Long Beach to Sherman Oaks, and the kind of territories one you know, goes across. So wondering what those destinations are, and how in some place, you know, versus a, you know, New York City or something where there's a kind of an inherent density. What does that mean in a place like Sherman Oaks if you were to do that? Or you question, you know, home ownership. Is there kind of communal ownership? Is there kind of, you know, an idea that there's a questioning of land ownership and kind of things that are in contemporary culture, you know, really questioning the land on which any of us sit right now, right? And what does that mean in terms of, you know, larger cycles of labor and you know, extractive technologies and what that means. So I think it would be interesting to kind of bring that into the discussion.
I think these are really, oh, sorry, go ahead, Luke.
I already spoke. Okay. Yeah, I was going to say I'm slightly wary of maybe referencing this with present company accepted, because I also think that the article was written by outsiders looking in, I think by some English people writing about California. But I think when it links back to the idea of, I think the really interesting points about the tension in the term solar punk, and that being potentially quite a productive one. It also made me think of, I think there's an article called The Californian Ideology, which was written about Silicon Valley. And in a way, it made me think that there's actually, again, there's something really nice in these kind of tensions, because I think that the Californian ideology was written by, I think, some British guys about the curious mix in Silicon Valley between like absolute devotion to capitalism and the idea that your idea can generate you a lot of money, but also with this kind of countercultural kind of way of working and of conceiving of ideas, and how it produces this kind of weird tension. And to me, that kind of actually seems that solar punks are kind of perfect personification of some of these things that you're talking about, with someone like Elon Musk, who's, you know, on the one hand using social media to clearly, like, you know, manipulate markets and things like that, and on the other hand is also doing endeavors that are kind of at the very cutting edge of science. And I think for me there's a kind of really nice tension there in the project that I find, yeah, really quite interesting and tantalizing, because some of the things that are sort of strange about the project and romantic seem to me to tie quite nicely into some of the kind of slight weirdness of the culture generated by some of the people that would actually be facilitating these things. But I guess the other point that was raised that I thought was really interesting one was about this notion of prefabrication. Obviously, if you think now we're just starting to get into the world of 3D printing buildings, and they take on a certain type of form. But in a way, there's something really interesting to me about that as well, that you know, if you think of, you can also do things like you can plug Minecraft directly into a 3D printer, so you can build something in a kind of virtual world at 1-to-1 and kind of output it straight to a printer. But also the form of those, and I think it comes back to some of the things that you've chosen in terms of the language of this, that you could imagine this might end up looking more like Tatooine, because these things are kind of 3D printed, and there's something that looks almost like it's a simplistic construction, but it's actually really kind of tied into digital fabrication in a really kind of intense way that also, I suppose, celebrates the particular nature of some of the tools that we've got now that are going maybe beyond the factory, that allow you to mass customize things and directly kind of produce them on site from a game potentially. So I think there's kind of, yeah, for me, there's those two aspects of the project are really, really fascinating. But I think there is, I think there's more things to examine, both in the kind of cultural setup that you've done for the project, which I think is a really nice tension, and also the prefabrication, as other people have mentioned as well.
No, these are really fascinating points, and I first just want to congratulate you, Shuai. Incredible presentation, and I think just elevating the discussion with the kind of comprehensive nature of your proposal, and the animation's quite incredible. So well done. I am quite familiar with Sherman Oaks, so this project is both surprising in many ways and extremely conservative in others. And I'm going to just try to like figure out the easiest way to say this. So if we think about the history of the valley, San Fernando Valley, drought, no water, completely artificially induced to get any, let's say, commercialism there or any real estate activity there. And eventually through a certain kind of demographic imposition, the valley starts to flourish in the 50s and 60s post-war America. And eventually Sherman Oaks becomes the center of where symbolic consumption happens at the Galleria, where the Ventura Freeway and the Ventura Boulevard are these kinds of very, very well-known ways of moving. And the history of this place, both from it being founded by one of the kind of, let's say, one of the main figures of the Pacific Railroad that founded, which made most of LA, well, now the railroads are mostly gone or we're trying to remake them, but at that time had a huge influence by kind of real estate development in Sherman Oaks. And all of this is happening in a way for a specific kind of audience. And this audience is, like I said, kind of in part coming back from World War II. And the buildings that are getting produced are prefab in a certain way for that moment in time. And the really kind of ironic part of your project, for me anyway, is that your idea that everybody's going to kind of be in this more totalizing or unifying system is the very thing that I thought we were working to break. Otherwise, the homogeneousness, the kind of continuity or unity of places like Sherman Oaks and the San Fernando Valley, they kind of otherwise reinstate these types of territorial lines that I think are really obviously reinforced through power and finance and real estate, but are really getting called into question. So on one hand, I think you've just reinstated what is already there. It just looks a lot different, but the underlying kind of assumptions are very similar. And then I would say, this is the kind of ironic part, sorry to go on so long, but that the wood frame itself that has made most of the valley is actually been hacked into, and I think I really liked the way Joe was putting this from the Normcore, and this kind of, ability to sort of like get in there and move things around and take the normal or the everyday and to kind of remake it. In a way, the wood frame has that looseness to it because it allows you to, knock it down, move walls around, and, turn a 4-bedroom into a startup and a garage into a rock band. And, anything can kind of happen in these valley houses out of wood. And I'm not sure that would be possible with your scenario. It's got such specificity to it. And so, I think it's a fantastic thesis, and it's just, making my mind kind of spin around these topics. And where do you take, like, where is the position, and is that the ethics of the position, how important is that? Or is the thesis much more just kind of a technological proposition, which obviously has ethics attached to it as well? Anyway, fascinating. Thank you for sharing the work today. Really, really wonderful to see it, and congratulations.
Yeah, maybe I just want to say a few things about the politics of the project, which is maybe what also Devin was pointing to, I think, and what Luke was mentioning when it comes to the idea of California ideology. I think this is maybe Shui's kind of very direct understanding of the story from coming from Stuart Brand and kind of sliding into the, you know, kind of the Silicon Valley ideology. I think the project is very much in that vein. I would say it doesn't really question or kind of try to make any kind of critical stance towards this history, which I think is really interesting. Shui is someone who is kind of committed to utopian thinking, which kind of I think this is something we discussed a lot, this idea that solar punk is maybe the last utopia, and of course it appears to be misplaced. But I do think it's something to kind of value. It's something of value, let's say, because it is, I think utopian kind of imaging is not there anymore in many ways.
I'm having a hard time hearing you, Damien.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm not sure if you guys do too.
Do you hear me now?
Yeah, much better. Okay. That's much better. Yeah.
Yeah, I think very similarly to the previous project. I think it's a kind of a the main struggle is how to produce a utopian image or something which is not merely a dystopian kind of image of architecture, which then of course brings all these kind of the entire baggage with itself, which is kind of uncritical acceptance of certain politics, and which is coming from California ideology, sliding into the first digital, and now of course with Elon Musk with this new contemporary, libertarian politics. So I think. But Shui, I think you're unapologetic about that, which is your position. So I would like to, say congratulations for that. Yeah. If there are other questions or thoughts, we can still have a few minutes.
I mean, this is not totally out of sequence. I wanted to bring that up later before, but yeah, I mean, I think there's a challenge with creating this utopian image, right? In the sense, like, as soon as you want to convey a certain, like, I don't know, technology or surface or material, it seems like hard to detach yourself from the standard notion of what that looks like. So, for example, here the solar panels, I think, are an interesting fact, right? So, I was actually wondering at one point, and also, like, of course, the landscape. I was wondering at one point, would this be a video of how you sell the LA crowds this new kind of proposal? So it's more like an ad rather than actually a kind of literal idea of how that design will be made, right? Because I do think, like, for example, here in this image, right, we see some tiles or a tile notion. So, I mean, I think you need a certain amount of defaulting to the well-known image and the familiar in a way of, conveying maybe suburbia, because that also has its tradition, I think, in US history. So thinking of all the, like Sears homes and so on. But even now, when you look around, there's a lot that still gets sold by just like romanticizing the image of, and that can be done through materials, right? But for example, when I think about solar panels, I mean, we're so much further already. I was just looking at that for a competition in Switzerland. I mean, there's so much out there. Like, for example, just the fact that solar panels don't have to be blue again. But in a way, I like it in your project. So because I think there's some sort of consciousness about you have to do that in order to advertise or convey your project, because otherwise you would be too far away of maybe what people would know, right? Because I think suburban planning is different than maybe many other planning. So I find that very fascinating in a way, but it made me think of all these the default notions that we go to and illustrations when we're forced to make a kind of a design move, right? But I just want to encourage you as a designer. I hope that you know that there are other products out there that can be integrated. I think I mean the 3D printing I think is really interesting as a module. I think in order to kind of create more standardized models as well as. But I would be interested. Like for me, like the question is also like, is there like a logic of how these things have to be arranged, and then there's just a certain amount of outcomes, so very mathematically, like, or is it just like really that, you know, I don't know. I think I would love to see more of that in the future of your project, because I think it has so much potential. So I really enjoyed the presentation and all your research you've done. I think there's so much in there that we could talk about today and in the future.
Let's say to take up Nicole's question a little bit, Shui, in the time we've got. I mean, I think it's interesting having done away with the kind of the logic of suburban subdivision and kind of roads and cul-de-sacs that would have structured them. Your housing, and most of them are kind of compound units of one kind or another, but whether they're single or not, they arrive basically as follies in a field, and a pretty tightly packed field. But because you've actually run with something you know, that within LA city planning, if you're building anywhere near a high transit intersection, you no longer have to include parking. And if you took that logic writ large, you'd end up with something like the logic of your community. And one of the effects of that is that you're seeing all the buildings from her pedestrian vantage point, and you're seeing them in the round. That the whole issue of suburban frontality that so preoccupies Robert Venturi and everybody after Venturi, Scott Brown, really falls away in a paradigm where garden apartments are in this you know, solar punk garden. And I think you've set up a really fascinating challenge in that sense, and the way it ties into a larger and new, you know, a larger and barely imagined transit system is incredible. But I do think the term folly ends up resonating on a few different levels in your scheme and in your scenario with different implications.
I think I thought the point about the kind of the advert is really fascinating, because obviously there's, I guess, many examples of suburban developments that are incredibly, you know, tightly related to the economy that generates them, and the need to sell plots, the need to sell houses. And I think for me, there's also the thing that maybe is spoken about a little bit less, but obviously you've made these really wonderful videos, but the idea of a virtual version of this. And I think to me, there's something really interesting there about the agency of advertising as well, because, you know, in the past, it could have been a billboard, or it could be a show home. If you look at fashion companies now, you know, they're making video games and they're making clothes for avatars, and they're kind of taking advantage of the fact that new generations are very, you know, very familiar with these type of, and maybe don't necessarily want to draw distinctions between virtual and real in the same ways as we might have done in the past. And I think the idea of building this kind of second version, which is this video game version, almost as an advert or a sales tool to not only depict the architecture, but the kind of idealized society that might take place within that, to attract people to want to live there, I think is something really fascinating that you've kind of opened up on. And I can only imagine is going to become, you know, more and more of a tool, as obviously game engines are now. Well, I mean, there's a lot of architectural visualization tools now that are directly based on game engines. So those two worlds are kind of collapsing. And I think, to me, there's something really interesting about the generational aspect of suburbia as well, and that maybe suburbia is often attached to certain ways of living or people at a certain, time in their lives maybe, but through sort of these other ways of advertising or kind of promoting these spaces to people, you might also kind of captivate people in a different way, which I suppose to me sort of links back to, again, Elon Musk. And if you think of where electric cars were, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago, they were sort of curious things, but now they're these kind of objects of desire, and every car company is now marketing them as lifestyle things, not just as ecological things. Perhaps those two also become conflated a lot. But for me, there's something also, if you think about the media with which you've used to explore this project, I think there's some really interesting questions about how architecture is sold to clients, to other people, and how the field of media for doing that is kind of expanding all the time, and will potentially keep on becoming a kind of key part of practice. And I think that's to me is a really fascinating part of this project as well.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Shui. Congratulations.
Okay, thanks for all the comments. Thank you.
And let's make a short break, 10 minutes. So we come back at 4:38 to start the next batch. We have 3 more students after. Okay. See you soon. Okay, we are back. I hope that everyone is still there. Okay, great. Okay, a few, maybe a minute, one more minute, and then we can start. Okay, fantastic. So our next student is Yu Hong Gong.
Hi everyone, I'm Yu Hong. I can share my screen. To live is to leave trace. The trace of occupants also leave their impression on the interior. Written by Walter Benjamin. In discussing the reason breadth of the interior, there is an interior in the detective novel. Can there be a detective story of the interior itself, of the hidden mechanism by which space is constructed as interior? Where would the trace would be imprinted? What clues do we have to go on? In the Muller house, it points to a conspicuous yet conspicuously ignored feature of Lucy's house. Not only are all those windows either obscure or covered with curtain, but the organization of the space and the disposition of the building furniture seems to hinder access to them. Moreover, upon entering a Lucy's interior, one is continually turning around to face the space one has just moved through, rather than the space ahead or space outside. So for Luz, the view of the exterior is contained within a view of interior. A sense of comfort is produced by two seemingly opposing conditions, intimacy and control. Today, the boundary between public and private vanished, where home is becoming more and more a place for work and an instrument for subsistence. Domesticity invade every field of human activities, with shops that are camouflaged as office, as game room, as restaurant, as kitchens. Thus, furniture today serves to sell oneself more than to tell a story about oneself. To feel at home anywhere is possible afterward. It is almost certain that the host has a home furnished in the same way. The environment we design so far try to attract a relationship between life and form that is not fulfill the normal functional terms, but the challenging life to survive under abnormal conditions. During the pandemic, Animal Crossing became one of the most talked about games in the world. There have been more than 38 million tweets about the game since its release, many celebrating its ability to provide comfort and social connection in a time of isolation and struggle. By giving a close look to this social simulation game, it's obvious that a virtual landscape which is based on gaming engine and developed by those players themselves is not only embedded in our daily life, but also act as an irreplaceable urban place. Moreover, episodic video games that can be both exceedingly fictional and incredibly mundane, not only indicates its similarity with our daily life, but also have the potential to integrate multiple activities containing their hyperspatial experience and ultimately enriching the definition of life under its filter of cozy and therapy. In order to consider how the new domestic landscape in the contemporary world will look like, I decided to design a campus at a residential area by using some idea inspired by Animal Crossing. However, the composition of this game landscape is partially different from the physical one. Firstly, everything in the game is about objects. Those vacant areas defined by those walls and other architectural items can be regarded as one asset of objects library that is offered to the players to construct their own island. And secondly, the plan becomes more flattened and decentralized. One feature of those buildings in Animal Crossing is that though most of them have various interior space and functions, all of them occupies the same space on the map. In short, all buildings don't present their real scale. So in this virtual domestic landscape, they are more close to an iconic entrance of a folded interior space. And also those characters not only help to enrich the background history of the landscape, but also develop a more immersive phenomenon for players by containing as many as possible activities, which may happen inside this community. That's it. I can repeat what I just read.
Can you maybe talk a little bit about at least in your renderings, the kind of role of the context? I mean, does it context play a role in your project at all? Is it just something you need as a kind of backdrop or a kind of foregrounding of something? Because it also seemed to be somewhat kind of suburban landscape, sort of undistinguishable maybe, but I'm just curious, like in your mind, is the project somewhat autonomous, isolated kind of in kind of imagination, or is there a kind of context for which it reacts to or against?
So for this project, what I'm trying to do is to like create a space, not too physical, but also it's like between the virtual world and the real. Yeah, so that's why there has lots of like blurred space, which cannot be simply defined as interior or exterior, and also contain lots of feature, which just that's what I talk about, like just extract from some video games, and especially those colors, shapes, and also the strategy I use to like organize them. Yeah.
But I think I have a question because I understand that in the kind of current modes of thinking that maybe there's less and less kind of distinguishing between the virtual and the real. I still do that because I'm old. And I wonder where your project lives. Obviously, it's in exploring an intersectionality between, let's say, the video game and the domestic landscape. But in your projection, where does this project live? Because at the moment, I think it's taking on more of the language of the video game, perhaps, than the language of an architecture dealing with context, like Jeff was saying, or things like structure, enclosure, et cetera. So I think it might be helpful, perhaps, for you to position it for us, or to say it cannot be positioned.
So it's like where the project is, like a simple introduction about the site I chose, or because at that time the project is located as a residential area, because the topic I chose is about domesticity, and also I just chose a normal residential area. So it can give me more opportunity, or I don't need to consider the maybe historical fabric about this.
Yuan, can I ask a question on that point actually? You are, I think, aware in your title, are you aware of the exhibit, The New Domestic Landscape, in 1972 at the Museum of Modern Art? Are you referring to that?
No, I don't think so.
I didn't want to catch you off guard, but I'm finding, because I'm an architect, but I'm also a theorist and historian. So I found a lot of interesting parallels that if you're not aware of this project, I think you could find ways that it could reinforce your project rather than fight against what you're doing now. So in the context of 1972, Emilio Ambas, as a designer, and afterwards I'll put in the chat some of these names if I'm speaking too quickly, but it was an exhibit that brought together a whole number of Italian designers, and it was called The New Domestic Landscape. So things that you're doing, you're calling it home-topia, right? To think of the home. In Italian, what they may have said was in terms of domus, or the idea of, so I'm finding that you have these overlaps. And I think when looking at this earlier, and a lot of, even the prior two projects, we've all been talking a lot about the 1960s, and there's certain ways that some of that work is brought forward here, and to rethink it 50 years on, I think is interesting, right? So, and this project called and I'm looking at your title, Domestic Landscape in the age of video game. I think you take something, so I'll just describe that project for a couple of seconds here. But what that exhibit did was look at a range of architects, and I just mentioned one of the contributors, Andrea Branzi, in the last project. But it was kind of this realm where collage, in the work of Super Studio, the idea of an extensive grid, other ways of living, we're very much in discussion, right? And I think that your project does that. In that time, the way into the virtual was through the collage or through the imagination, and the physical was really based in a lot of the products that were produced to produce those kind of spaces. So that show, and it's got a beautiful catalog and lots of, Manfredo Tafori, who's a theorist, wrote essays. It's I think that it could add some theoretical depth to the project you're working on. So I think that as you bring this forward, to contemporary times, what does that mean in a time where you're actually thinking of simulation, and you were talking about worlds and game engines and these kind of spaces in between an occupation, and also being able to push. I'm wondering, even in much of your representation, we're seeing kind of hovering over some of these landscapes. And I'm wondering, if you kind of go in and you begin to engage some of these, places, quote unquote, the tactility at like the body level, whether you're kind of occupying an avatar or, you know, the physical body. So I think the project's really super interesting and I think your references were really, you know, interesting as well. And, you know, I'm trying to look at my notes, you know, this intersectionality between, let's say, the virtual and the real. And I think there are other precedents that you can take and move on from. So those were just some thoughts I was having about your process and your project.
I want to ask a few questions. I'll also offer some thoughts. I got excited about your project, your thesis, with the beginning entry, the connection to loss, and the connection to video game. To me, that seems pretty coherent up until that point. And the aspect of domesticity that can come out of the compounding of those notions, it's also super interesting. However, the direction in which you decided to take your project, and to me, the vehicle that you use to test your hypothesis, your aim, ends up at a kind of theme park level, right? Ends up being a little bit of an outer show of those ideas, right? And I'm curious why the issue of interiority or the domestic interior could have been taken both in architecture terrain and video game terrain a little bit more serious, right? Like understanding where are the limits of that space of interrogation, like furniture, interior objects, everything that if you want to kind of survey and enumerate built-in furniture, everything that kind of creates that kind of form of domesticity, if that could be more the kind of, I don't know, the focus of the thesis, because I think if we take these ideas and apply them at any typology or at if we don't kind of circumvent the limits of the exploration a little bit, we begin to run other risks in which that, in my opinion, the argument dilutes quite a bit.
Yeah, I thought the early points that you make about the role of windows is potentially a really interesting connection, because so much of video game space is about kind of limit and about controlling like how much you render of the world while still giving the effect of a world beyond. So the agency of a window in a video game interior might be quite different to Lucy's agency, but they might actually use a similar kind of technique, which is that you can sort of see light coming in, but you can't necessarily see beyond that. And but the some of the techniques might have kind of comparisons, but then the kind of reason for them existing is potentially quite different. I mean, I think that I remember this project, seen, I guess it's the third time now, and I think for me there's some really fascinating, there's a few drawings you've got in this Animal Crossing bit where I think what maybe they might actually be about to come up on the screen, but what I think things like this, where I presume you're analyzing things like the kind of the curved landscape of the game. And I think for me there's something really productive in almost being, I'm not sure literal is the right word, but in taking the game world very much in what it gives you and then trying to kind of deconstruct that, which maybe I feel is not kind of so present in the final project. So, you know, for instance, I would say that the Animal Crossing, it has a very fixed viewpoint of the world, doesn't it? And that also it kind of places limitations on the way that the world can be seen. And it then also the nature of the game with its kind of like chibi style where everything's kind of short and fat and people have big heads, it creates this kind of real disjunction between the inside and the outside of the buildings. You know, you can make your house bigger and it gets a little bit bigger on the outside, but not much. There's quite a difference between the inside and the outside. And I think, you know, something like that, for instance, because your final project is so kind of open, it leaves me to, I think it raised some questions that I think could be kind of really producing some incredibly strange architectural conditions. Even the idea of, in computer graphics, like using things like shaders, which are obviously going to change the appearance of geometry in relation to the virtual camera, which is what I presume is what they kind of do in Animal Crossing, because it wouldn't really make sense for them to model the world as a cylinder, but it appears as a cylinder on the camera. But this idea that the camera that something's viewed through is also having a kind of effect that's distorting the geometry, again, to me is kind of key to the aesthetic of the way that Animal Crossing represents space. And I think there could be something kind of interesting there. But I guess coming back to the points about Archizoom and that kind of era of things, what's also interesting, and I guess you've got a hint to it on the floor level of your proposal, is that, again, Animal Crossing has got a sort of it's all based on a grid, isn't it? It's got this kind of feeling that it's not grid based, but it's entirely, you can place objects wherever you want, but it has to be distributed on a grid, and that in itself produces kind of interesting, interesting spatial behaviors by players when they want to build or create a certain type of structure. To me, it's like you see people trying to make really grand buildings, and they take advantage of the camera and the grid by like putting flat things or objects that then appear in different scales around the building to make it look like a palace, because it's impossible to make a palace in the game for real. There's this kind of really interesting sort of spatial creativity that takes place within that game. So I guess to me, what probably the question that comes out of this, which is more a sort of comment, so I apologize, is what's the role of the viewpoint in this building, and is there an idealized viewpoint where it's seen from, in the same way that you might have got from Animal Crossing, or from obviously looking at Adolf Loos space, where you move through space and you get kind of views through it in different ways, which kind of generate something interesting. Can you identify, are there kind of key moments within your project that are these kind of places where everything, I don't know, either resolves itself or becomes more tense as a result of where you're standing and looking at it?
Yeah, I think this is a great comment, look, and really spot on. I think in the research phase of the project, I think we spoke a lot about this idea that kind of Animal Crossing and these kinds of fixed viewpoint games are really continuing a certain idea of the domestic landscape and domesticity. And I know that you also make an argument in one of your texts about, and we spoke about this many times, the kind of the similarity between 60s utopian propositions and video game spaces. And I think this is really, I think where the project is in this kind of realm, trying to work between the precedents and trying to actually kind of read them from the media kind of point of view, from the contemporary media point of view. I think where maybe it's a little bit unclear, and it's in the final video, which kind of uses the camera that is completely unhinged, it kind of goes everywhere. And I think that's maybe a betrayal in a way of the initial idea. But I also understand why she wanted, why Yuhong wanted to kind of do that. It's because suddenly it became like an architectural project with the site. And I think that's the main question of what many people are asking is why a site, why this kind of idea of a theme park? While I think there was a really radical reading, both of the historical precedent, but also the game itself as this kind of strange architectural space that could be activated by these mechanisms of looking and by the mechanisms of design that you have observed. I think that maybe this is the question that I think is at the core of the project.
It's interesting to me, Damien and Luke, that in terms of viewership and a kind of there's a very I like this thesis a lot, and I like it because it kind of takes up central questions of visuality in a really forthright way. And the Corbusier quote on Los is sort of wonderfully apropos. Corbusier is befuddled by Los's interest in privacy because his notion of visuality is all about visual command and transparency, about locating the modern viewer as high above the cityscape as possible, with as much view in and out of his new realm as possible. And Beatrice Colomina's book, it's not Privacy and Publicity, is it? I guess it's a chapter maybe in there on the two of them is a really brilliant kind of plays out plays out the tension in these two very different models of vision as they informed early modern architecture, and the degree to which almost most architects fall on a very complicated spectrum between these two positions. And I think an architect who interestingly problematizes their game is Rem Koolhaas, and he does so by looking at the city of Manhattan through the gamescape of Coney Island. The opening of Delirious New York takes place from seeing one island basically from another island, and the architecture of one island through the follies again of another place. And the degree to which you have an architecture of framing, or an architecture of foreground and framing, and an architecture of the paradigmatic city becomes very important for him. But I think in your thesis and on this whole issue of interiority and how it becomes both game space and a kind of psychological, different, I think, a spectrum of psychological extremes of interiority. I think what's striking to me actually is that your proposal in the end pulls out of the Losian and Corbusian dyad of what it means to be inside of modern architecture and look out of it or not, and looks at it more urbanistically in terms of, in a way that Koolhaas I think becomes important. But even before that, and I think really, and I came to your project a bit late and was sort of fighting my way to a familiarity. What your project reminds me most of, and I mean this as a profound compliment, it looks very de Chirico to me. The kind of vacant, attenuated cityscape game space of your construct, and to a certain degree the way you move through it and stage it, seem very, very close to that sense of kind of ghostly psychological interiority that wouldn't have to do with an architect's notion of spatial enclosure, but of pictorial space and the way our associations begin to kind of crowd us psychologically. And I think that too probably has some rhyme with a game I haven't played. But I think it's a fascinating thesis that ends up kind of burgeoning in a lot of different directions, perhaps in the way the game itself, wants you to, but then bounds you in certain ways from going too far.
Yeah, I think to that point, I think one of the really interesting observations that Johan made is almost reading Animal Crossing as a critique of this idea of Cartesian worlds that is kind of behind video game design, as Luke was explaining this idea of the Cartesian grid as being a regulating device for the world itself. And I think to kind of go back in history and read Los, the interior, which is kind of regulated by the elevated view from onto the space, as an alternative to the Corbusian kind of clarity, which then becomes turned into the final apotheosis of modernity with Superstudio and Archizoom. I think it's a really interesting idea, especially because Animal Crossing kind of beats that move, but also bends space and produces different kinds of interiors and different kinds of conditions. But I think in the project, there is there are a lot of different layers where this is played out, but maybe in the final video is more a neutral kind of observation, which then kind of confuses a little bit the central research, you know.
I mean, this is a really straightforward comment coming from me as a designer, but I find it actually really pleasing what I see beyond just the research. Like I think there's I don't know, I feel like you have a really good sensibility for design proportion and I don't know, kind of maybe combinations of elements, which I think all of these sequences are really, really nice. I mean, I was wondering about the, you know, that shot where you show the figure in the space, and if I would want to see a figure in the space for scale or not. Also questioning a little bit the surrounding houses that are modeled. Do I want to see that or not, or is it just its own thing somewhere out on an island? And I just buy the viewpoint. I mean, maybe a little bit emphasizing on what Luke said, like just kind of telling you how tall things are relative to what we see in the image. But I do think it's in a way very kind of beautiful as it is staged and as a sequence, which I really want to compliment you on. I think that's it's really nice. I think it's always hard in, like, especially thesis, to make that kind of step from research to actually designing in some cases. And I think you've done that in a way. I don't know. I feel like you enjoy besides all of what has been said, and maybe that the research could have done it, or you could have thought of it in a more on point way in terms of what came out. I think as a final kind of the movie and so on, I think it all makes it's very pleasing. It's very aesthetically really nice. So compliments on that.
Agreed. It's beautifully thought out. And yeah, as you were describing it, Nicole, it was a pleasure just to look around that landscape, look around that, both, you know, as a landscape and as an architectural environment. It's nice to see a project where someone's got a really acute sense of proportion. Things actually work. It's really, it's a pleasure on that kind of prosaic level. And this is a really good time in your life to know that you've got that facility. And you know, frankly, I'm so glad you're leaving SCI-Arc. I hope SCI-Arc had something to do with you acquiring it, but I'm really glad you've got it however you came by it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to sort of maybe talk about the trajectory of the project again, I think, yeah, I would agree. I think there's something really slightly unreal in the output that does carry some of the sensibilities of the game that you've looked at, you know, although I've obviously made some other comments about, you know, the particular nature. But I suppose in the sphere of a thesis as well, I'd say it's like it's really cool to see someone start with Adolf Loos and go to Animal Crossing and end up in something. And I think for me, I love a project that could have those kind of links, which immediately you might think, I'm not sure how those connect up, but actually, you know, you've kind of been brave enough to take us to make those jumps. And I think those types of associations are really, really interesting, because the thesis is a great place for you as a student and, you know, a young architect to go like back and forth between architectural history and thinking about how a video game by Nintendo can make us think about, you know, canonical architecture in a slightly different way. I think that's like a really great and productive set of thoughts to have at this point, and hopefully for the future as well, because it's really fascinating to be able to make those type of connections and see what happens.
Yeah, I love this comment about Nintendo, because Nintendo is considered to be probably the only non-fascist kind of game platform, right? All the other platforms are really kind of dedicated to this idea of what we really would call ballistic vision, you know, kind of hyper modernity, and kind of looking through being behind the gun and kind of experiencing the fight. I think I think it's Nintendo. I think it's an unexplored, also maybe under theorized in a way that it produces its effects. I've seen that Alicia has written about Huizinga and the idea of play as a liberatory kind of political act. I think it's really within the platforms that game kind of spaces are published on. I think Nintendo's platform is really probably the one where it's only unapologetically about play in its like purest form, which I think it has like a liberatory potential in many different aspects. Because mostly I think architectural or let's say some kind of design theory related to games usually kind of derives from this other history of like action or the interactive kind of or let's say the fighting idea, which is first person camera. I really like this the move into other more kind of esoteric maybe territories with Nintendo.
I think that's a really interesting discussion that we're having though about what is play in game space today. And I'm no expert, but just moving from the setup of games and video games onto kind of more sophisticated games, having something to do with the render engines and the kind of, let's say the way that the hardware is set up had a lot to do with, and Luke, I'm sure can speak to this as well, had a lot to do with what kind of ways you could image something, whether it was more like 2D and so forth. But now the idea of play, I think, is actually maybe not so present in game space, or at least let's say the more commercial games, that those are really just like most of the algorithms behind social media and so forth. These are things that are very much have bias. They very much have a certain kind of, let's say, intentionality about how to keep someone playing. They do things to the body, to the mind, to keep one in that kind of atmosphere, where I think the idea of play, or at least the kind of more, the kind of earlier notions of play, had to do with some things that were spontaneous, that were unpredictable. I think about, I forgot the name of it, but like maybe Christina will remind me, the exhibition that we looked at from the 60s in, I think, London or Amsterdam, where people kind of like could just like move art around and children could come in and things were like truly playful in the sense that actions could happen. And I can't read and talk at the same time.
Not to interrupt you. Sorry.
No, please interrupt me. No, please do so. I'm just saying, I think it's a really interesting, like these words about predetermined or indeterminate or chance. I think those are fantastic kind of things that we could imagine the architecture allowing for. And I'm just asking this question out loud to myself, using the gaming model, which I think is a fascinating prompt, but using the gaming model, the parts of that are actually very predetermined, that are, very constructed and that are very tied to a certain kind of hardware and software. Whereas out in the world, it could rain, the clouds could move, something could fall, someone else could show up on the scene. I mean, there's like a level of unpredictability, chance, or play that is just not really, in a game environment, no matter, at this point, we can obviously say AI and so forth is going to push it and make it more that way. But that's, I think, one of the kind of the beauties of kind of beautiful thing about architecture and constructing it is that you can't predetermine everything that's going to happen. It can become something else, or people can use it in ways that weren't expected. And I think all that's sort of like bubbling up underneath the thesis. So it's fascinating discussion, Yuang. I just wanted to, thank you for bringing this up. I think it's super interesting. Now let me read the chat, Alicia.
The last part is actually not so coherent. I was just trying to say that, you're speaking of algorithm, right? So the idea of, like, one could think in, in game simulation, and I don't know, some of my work looks at kind of history of computation, but the idea of like having to introduce some N feature, something that is going to actually keep a system from being reduced to entropy, and like thinking about how like the algorithm works in that way. When they're, what are those selections? How does one do it? So I was just, so I guess in my own work, I think much about these things in terms of their relation to, choice, chance. How can that be, brought to a project where you do invite the participant, and is that something that is only within a virtual environment, or can it be a physical environment? What lessons do we learn from the past, where some of those questions might be deeply social and political, or at least that's kind of where, what I'm staking out is things that I look at a lot. And, how does that transpose to today? But also, for me being a bit older, also trying to understand kind of these, young, like bringing to the table here, challenging me to kind of rethink what you're producing and what you're thinking through with some of the older work. And I do think that, as a historian as well, like these kind of loops that we make can bring things productively forward, and the present can productively read the past. And that can keep us all moving, no matter what age we are, as creative people. Anyway, so those were some of my thoughts. And I think that your project, Young, really like brings that to the fore and kind of moves across those different platforms, or media or times or something like that. So super interesting.
Great, we are right on time. Thanks everyone for the great conversation. And thank you, Yuhong.
Thank you.
Really cool project.
Thank you, Christina, for the mural.
And Christina is next.
Hi.
Okay.
I'll share my screen. Okay. I have put a mural link where you can access the presentation if you wish to. So today I will be presenting my project, Iowa, which is a digital art museum for Tokyo. My thesis examines the future of the museological institution as a centralized architectural apparatus that evolves and continues. I am sorry, but I forgot to share sound. Super sorry. My thesis examines the future of the museological institution as a centralized architectural apparatus that evolves and continuously expands as a response to contemporary catalysts. Art curation began with the first 16th century private cabinets of curiosities to later on develop into a dependent system of curation and display within such intricate institutions as the first public-built museums. This project is for a new type of museum that collapses to contemporary trends in art that are both destabilizing the traditional art museum as an institution and the way viewership and ownership is dealt with, involving user experience, virtual art display, and the way house storage is dealt with, but are rarely brought into dialogue with each other. The first of these two is the institution of the free port and the unseen private background of the art storage and display economy. The Geneva Freeport, the one you see on this slide, is a warehouse complex in Switzerland for the storage of art and other valuables and collectibles, also known for the opacity of Switzerland's storage and custom laws. Described as the greatest art collection that nobody gets to see, prominent figures in the art world have been raising concerns about the fact that countless and priceless pieces of art are stored away from public view and treated as an investment, meaning these cultural objects might as well not exist. The second one is digital art, most formally known in the way of NFTs. The NFTs is basically a non-fungible token, currently seen as an evolution of fine art collecting, only with digital art, changing the nature of how art is actually being bought and sold. While on the one hand, analogous to the question, if a tree falls in the forest and nose around to hear it doesn't make a sound, the Freeport begs the question, if the art is never seen, is it still art? It has to do with the disappearance of physical things in the world.
The NFT almost asks the diametrically opposed question: is something art when it's almost nothing tangible, while at the same time representing almost pure forms of exchange? I chose to work on a museum in Tokyo, Japan at the NACT, on a museum site that is just beginning to address the dichotomy in its own thinking. The business model of the existing building denies a typical museum layout, focuses on the user experience and movability of the artwork. It's a building that sparks the start of a divergent museum typology. In the project you're going to see, I've pushed the prompt of what that institution is aiming to do in order to give equal weight to both of the extremes mentioned above, understanding that they really can't be seen as dichotomy or as binaries, that they actually have to be seen as fundaments now of what art is, and be able to hold them together culturally, intellectually, and architecturally. My museum proposal seeks to do just this, refusing to accept binaries and extremes as basic conditions of these two realities, and instead seeking ways to bring them into close architectural contact. In terms of process, I'm also interested in disturbing, or at least querying, the boundary between human and non-human forms of designing. What I chose to do is give voice to the digital and non-human agencies involved in thinking through art today, whether those are in form of artificial intelligence, or whether those are in more traditional forms, such as what Michael Fried referred to as things that give us goosebumps in a darkened room. I chose to welcome that into my design process by starting a virtual dialogue with an artificial intelligence entity, GPT-2, which is a way of prompting learning for both parties involved, until I actually felt comfortable that some of the design ideas on the table for this project were not coming solely from myself. And in the slide, I'm going to play some parts of our conversations for you.
The new museum building will hold the distinctive shape of viewing galleries
with a circular structure and a large circular lobby, a public plaza, which also supports the
technical infrastructure needed for
the museum, is projected from 2 levels below the ground and rises above as a series of vertical glass
cubes. The circular structure shall
bear a number of significant characteristics unique only to China, in particular the Chinese-style circular pavilion.
The circular shape shall bear its form out of
the concrete wall and also from
the digital
image displayed in both the exhibition and in real space.
The digital image shall
be able to transform through the user.
The final concept looks beyond one binary or another, beyond the physical world limit, beyond private, public, digital, physical, natural, artificial. It proposes a series of pods intended to allow for multiple immersive viewing experiences. The pods derive their shape and materiality from the essential elements occurring within the Japanese garden, specifically the stones. By adopting the aesthetic qualities of a natural element, the structure intends to emphasize the fine line between two apparently disconnected worlds continuously interweaving. The architectural manifestation dilutes the eye into perceiving it as the physical, but at the very core is the essence of an artificial structure able to mimic reality. The 6 pods offer no standard boundary between outside and inside. Access to them occurs via sensor-embedded structures that lower down and allow for a 360 degrees entry. The interior layout attempts no standard program, no ticket booth, no cafeteria. These are basically blank visual unknowns, where the hologram as well as the viewer can manifest freely, experiencing all spaces and senses at once. The plaza on ground level is mechanical and feeds the cubic infrastructural network of the museum. In some areas, the PVC glass material used for construction reveals the level below, the hidden private. The plan cut below 00 reveals a connection between the viewing pods, or IWAs, and the singular bizarre service level below, which is designed to continuously dispense physical artwork containers within the infrastructural storage galleries. This system proposes a series of interconnected underground tunnels that are designed to move physical and digital art on a continuous basis, day and night, regardless of the viewer presence on site. It engages a main access tunnel as the main movement artery, allowing trucks coming from the main access road to displace into access gates the containers storing art pieces. The plan cut above 00 reveals the direct relationship between the infrastructural network placed directly below the organic blank viewing pods and the building itself. The digital infrastructure that actually powers the plaza and the IWAS is also proposed on the underground level as a network embedded within the site itself. Art containers, as you can see in this diagram, are taken from the main artery and then either stored, waiting to be used, or immediately directed towards the main loading platform that opens up directly in the pod itself via vertical connection. The pod, or viewing gallery, is a shell structure built as a diagrid system to bear the loads. The outer and inner surface of the pod structure mimics concrete, a standard construction material, but is sensor embedded either to physically project a hologram on its surface or trigger the viewer experience locally. It is also an entry point for physical art containers. This engages multiple fields of vision for the user, the private museum, the back of house ensemble, and also freely the creation with the NFT of the user experience within the pods, all at once and is displayed. The interior condition of each of the galleries is distinct. It tries to engage the physical manifestation of the NFT as an entity able to interact with the user, but also in the infrastructure level below, the hidden of the freeport. And now I would like to invite you to look into a short glimpse of the world inside. Sorry. Thank you. That is it. I will open the video for discussion. Did the video have sound?
I can just say something till just a comment, because I'm from Switzerland and I thought it was interesting that you brought up Geneva as an example. Have you looked at the Schaulager by Herzog Demo as a contemporary museum of like storage for the what is the family called? But I was curious because that's the most contemporary, maybe different version of the art museum that I know that really talks about storage, or where storage is really important. Have you looked at that at all?
I mostly based my research on the free ports and the Geneva free ports and the idea of storing. But during the research itself, a lot of the input or a lot of attention went into actually viewership and how we store art and how that is actually changing in current times and how that is affecting the actual modern museum institution.
Yeah, no, that's why I bring it up. I think the Schaulager it's in Basel, and it's for this private collection by a family, a Swiss family. But it's really interesting the way it's organized as well, because there's only one smaller gallery area, and then everything, the upper levels are all storage. And I think one of the questions is, where do you store the pieces, and how big are the rooms relative to one another, and what do you exhibit next to one another, because they're different pieces that of course always have a relationship to one another, right? Let's say. And so if you're I've done research there for a project, and you can basically make an appointment with the art historian who is facilitating those big exhibitions that are happening in the main area and travel usually to MoMA and so on. They also do symposiums and so on, but they would curate you when you want to make an appointment. They're going to show you room XX with these pieces based on your interest. And so I find it just really interesting, because it's the only museum that I know is built that takes this idea of storage into consideration, but still place the storage out as a, let's say, viewer room for a small audience that usually are either academics or art historians or anyone who is in the field of research, which I think makes that also really critical. So I just want to encourage you to look at it. It's a wonderful project. If you're ever in Switzerland, I would totally recommend to give them a call and go and see it. I think the gallery has every half year a huge exhibition as well. So that's really worth seeing. But anyways, I just wanted to bridge the awkward silence.
Thank you.
But I think too, what's interesting, just to add to that, I mean, the free ports themselves and the kind of evolution of them, and you've probably seen them, in which there's one like architectural firm that's designed a few of them, at least. I think Geneva, then Singapore, they may or may not have been. I mean, Beijing, I don't think it's complete, but I think Beijing had proposed the largest art free port in the world at least 6 or 7 years ago. I just can't remember. And actually it was kind of in the shapes of stones. But what's really interesting about it is that the Freeport is a kind of autonomous zone, and it operates because of liberal economics, right, and politics. And I think it's like similar projects. You're wondering, like, is this a form of critique? I mean, the fact of just exposing art to a general public is one thing, and I totally agree. But I also wonder if it's still functioning within that kind of neoliberal kind of economy in the way that you're thinking about it, because these free ports actually function as places of exchange, right? So the whole fact is one can exchange art or goods or whatever, these luxury goods, over and over and over again. And the place is actually designed as for exactly that, right? And taxes aren't incurred unless you obviously bring that product back to your country or wherever. So they in a sense perpetuate the kind of neoliberalness of the economy in a sense of that. And so I'm just curious, like, in your research of that, how does that play in, or if anything, into the way that you think about the Freeport?
I think what I chose to think about the Freeport, the economical private background of them played an important role. I think that's what sparked my interest in bringing together these dichotomies. But mostly what intrigued me personally was this idea of actually hiding the art and not allowing the public to see it, or this connection between what is unseen, what is seen, and this idea of physical art, digital art. And sometimes the digital art is unseen, and also the Freeport is unseen. So this connection between them that sparked my interest and saw a common ground between them. It was the idea of image and how architecture can actually bring that together, how it can try to solve at least or spark an idea.
But I find the topic and the idea fascinating, Christina. The notion of storing art, cataloging it, and then trying to blur the kind of dichotomy between storage and display, and embedding in that the kind of user experience and the kind of participatory aspect that can come with digital art. That to me seems super interesting subject. I'm curious as to like, right? So if the architecture that you've created here, these big rock-like formations appear as a kind of canvas for these immersive experiences, projective art, and kind of ambience that gets created. That's one component of that, of what the display aspect of the project will be. There are others in which objects appear kind of stack or somewhat ad hoc, organized as if they were in a kind of storage. Those are the ones I'm more curious about. I guess the question that is on my head is like, what aspect of storage brings a different kind of discipline to the practice of display, right? Like how this idea that here there's a perhaps more fluid circulation between what's being stored and what's being displayed, to a point where it's probably constantly in flux, changes the culture of how we visit and participate in relationship to these works of art.
So basically, there are a number of ways, at least I try to address that in the project. First of all was the ground plaza, which reveals some of the level below, which is the storage level or the infrastructure service level. And in that way, while these pieces are continuously being brought and the service is doing its own thing, the viewer, which is on the 0-0 ground, can actually see how this process is taking place. And that is something that we usually are not allowed to see. So I guess this is a connection between display and storage. And also this idea that even art pieces, let's say you are in the pod itself and you get this digital NFT experience with the hologram, but then you also get these pieces, these containers that sometimes reveal themselves, sometimes are hidden, that are being brought to you up, and then you get to experience them. And it could be, for example, one you could see just as a container, as I showed in some of the animation, and in some you see the actual art that it's inside. So I believe it's a clash of these worlds that are trying to become an all-at-onceness display and storage.
But I think.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. I want to reinforce a little bit what Moxie, I think tried to say in the way that, the storage space, and again, that's why I brought up Herzog Demo. I think the question is, if it's really physical pieces, like how big are these rooms? Are they there, or are they just in the containers? But what does that mean? Where if it's just about delivering them, like what does the space really entail, right? And I think there's something about taking on agency as a designer as well. I would argue for that, because also like with these, I love the upper spaces that you're created, but at the same time, like if it's for the art, the question is, for example, even if it's digital art, right? Where does it get projected on? I once worked on a big museum in Switzerland, and we wanted to do these visible concrete walls, but it's just the fact that that's not really what you will see in the end for the. This all sounds really practical, but because you're you're already designed it so far, and I love the project. Don't get me wrong, I think the idea is really fantastic. But I would encourage you then also to think of, okay, if this is really made for these pieces, storage or exhibit, like what do I actually need additionally in order to kind of be able to facilitate the exhibition of art pieces in a way.
Can I throw out just, I actually think the notion of storage here is, I actually think this is less about storage than simply avoiding standard white box gallery space. That for the most part, I actually think the rhetoric of viewing art in its passage out of ideal museological white wall conditions into either its spaces of maintenance or archiving or storage are all about animating art in a way outside of our kind of singular presumptions about how we're supposed to encounter art. And I think we're all interested in those modes. I mean, even at the Broad, probably the most consistently interesting view at the Broad is the one into the storage vault. And you know, I think it is fascinating, but I also think it's a timely preoccupation. And so I'm actually interested in this architecture of your scheme in part because I think it updates some of the questions that Preston Scott Cohen was trying to take on in the Tel Aviv Museum. And I think the whole question of how how a subterranean gallery works, or why you would take art underground and what it implies to do so. In his case, how you extend the white gallery wall down into that realm. And in your case, how you move into a more kind of West-worldly notion of art maintenance or other, or kind of management. But the shift away from the museological, the big given of the museum as you move underground, I think is really interesting on a broader architectural level. But, and I think, it does seem like it's speculation that I've never felt as kindly towards NTFs as I do this minute, because some of it does look worth encountering. And I've often really wondered, it just seemed honestly, it seemed like digital, like really, really memory intensive digital baseball cards to me, traded by people that don't take art seriously. And that clearly isn't what it doesn't need to be that, and I should grow up.
The conversation is fascinating, and I like what you're saying, Joe, about the sort of animating and kind of problematizing the experience of art. And I think the way that you've explored ideas of access and storage, or the kind of at the intersection of the digital and the physical, for me is incredibly fascinating. And I think Joe's reading about the project as it relates to the basement or the underground is also fascinating. And I have to say, for me, it calls into question the role of the stones. Like, the stones are still, for me, the most the least convincing aspect of your project. I guess I could say it in another way, which is that it's almost like you have two projects. There's the project of the stone, and I had wondered if the stones were the direct result of your engagement with this kind of language model, which that is a whole other. And then I start wondering, like, what would John Cage or Duchamp or the Dadaists do with these AI language models? Is fascinating. But then there's the other project, which I think is what everyone's talking about, but maybe I'm oversimplifying it to kind of split it as a dichotomy in that way.
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting questions raised by this project, and I think the emphasis on storage and this, I guess, this kind of exposing this unseen infrastructure that allows the art market to kind of take place by also ensuring that these artifacts are kept in a situation or kept in conditions that allows them to sort of be in some kind of stasis. They don't degrade as far as possible. If they do, perhaps they can be, kind of repaired somehow in order to retain their value. and for me, there's just on that kind of level, there's something really interesting about the comparison between that and digital art. And I don't own any FTEs, but I can imagine that you store them like anything else in that realm with some kind of wallet, which might end up being a hardware wallet that you plug into your computer with USB, that takes these things and it kind of it connects them to a physical object, but a physical object that's a completely different scale to massive elevators and big forklift trucks and lorries delivering things, and this kind of miniaturization, I think, is kind of something that's really interesting in terms of the actual kind of spatial impact of the footprint might be much lower, although conversely there's obviously all of this other digital infrastructure that has a very large footprint in its own right. And there's something kind of interesting about this relationship between all the facilities you need to build to house the physical art collection, and I suppose all of the energy that might be used in the kind of digital art market that's not made concrete in the same way, but has a similar kind of impact and similar kind of logics. But I guess one thing that seems really interesting to me as well is obviously this concept of value, and I think the point made about what NFTs are and what their value is a really interesting one, because even as they're obviously being sort of appreciated a bit more, there's certain types of image that are maybe like connected to internet culture and things like that, which have a certain value, which is is not necessarily a million miles away from images that have value in the sort of physical art market. But there's a whole, I suppose, the sort of reference points and what's given value in the NFT market seems to be potentially quite different. And again, that's quite disruptive for the idea of placing these two systems together, where I mean, in a way, the stones of your building made me think of something like ether rocks, these kind of slightly badly drawn pictures of rocks that are actually worth, I don't know, millions of dollars as NFTs, and how something that sort of has a completely different sort of, in a way, value system of judgment compared to this sort of, I suppose, artists or pieces of work that have a kind of provenance that means that they have a value. To me, there's something really disruptive in that tension between there, that you might get like a painting by an old master that's 50 million. You might equally get a kind of clip art drawing of Doge that's worth, maybe it won't ever be worth that much, but it has, could have a very significant value. But it has, because the meanings that are attached to those two markets, they might have similar logics in some ways, but they also have very divergent logics in others. And I think, for instance, I guess it also reminded me of, I think someone wrote an article about visiting the museum to Beeple's art in crypto voxels, and someone made a little art museum there, and it's kind of interesting that they were critiquing it as a piece of architecture, as you would do a kind of traditional gallery sort of, and under those terminologies it doesn't seem like a successful piece of architecture. However, is the architecture that an NFT should ultimately inhabit, is the white cube or the white stone model the right one? I don't know, there's something quite I think disruptive in those tensions, which for me, I think your project is really interesting in starting to kind of open up, and in a way that the idea that something might not it might be a bit like an interloper into a space, I think is kind of really interesting, because there's no doubt that NFTs have become an interloper that's really shaken up the sort of established markets in many ways. So I think that for me is really, there's some really interesting openings in your project that can be explored more and more in the future. And I think having seen the project, other points throughout the year, it's a really exciting moment for this type of work, because things are changing. We thought the NFT boom had maybe like gone last time you showed the project, and now it's sort of back with a vengeance again, I guess. So it's really interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think another really interesting kind of line of thought that could be applied to the project is this idea of authorship and displacement of authorship. I think you're taking a managerial position towards these technologies, which is like, I think, one of the maybe possible, let's say, possible positions to take as a designer, right, today. Because, for example, GPT-3 and GPT-4, which is coming next year, I think, these are extremely well-guarded technologies, right? Like GPT-3 is owned by Microsoft, for example, it's licensed. So you wouldn't be able to interact with it on any meaningful level other than just almost like zooming with it, you know? It's kind of, these technologies are becoming extremely kind of quartered off. Or you can think about it almost like you're talking to an oracle that is in a basement somewhere. So it's like, I think your project has, sorry?
It felt that way.
Yeah, no, but it's interesting, I think, to kind of think about the role of an architect in that kind of context, and whether or not we can be more than managers or some kind of super user that has an access or has a conceptual understanding of what's behind it. I think also an interesting point is about NFTs, which are kind of a similarly opaque, you know, technology in many ways. I mean, they're kind of easy to understand in their blockchain, but the way that the value is produced is obviously opaque. And I think I'm interested when you're showing these kind of emanations of digital art, you know, and I also think that the basement kind of idea of the project is very much kind of suited to the entire idea of like the intermeshing of these kind of technologies, which are not entirely clear. We are not entirely clear how they actually really produce value, you know. So I think it's really interesting, that project, like a fluid idea.
Christina, oh, pardon me. I'm sorry. You go ahead, Alicia, please.
It's quick. I mean, sorry, Joe. Christina, I wanted to just quickly loop back to, I thought it was so interesting when you spoke about, you know, the aphorism, you know, if a tree falls in the forest, you know, did that event happen? Did that object happen? Right. We can see the residue afterward. And I actually would love you to kind of apply that, like through some of even just the thinking in terms of using the term, you know, you have digital, you have art, and you have museum, and just questioning what that museum is and the role of the spectator. Does someone kind of engaging create that art? Where is value? And you may have said it already, but I find that like that's really you know, profound idea about the project and something, you know, moving forward. You know, that then, you know, so many museums have just kind of capacity, kind of any kind of traditional art museum to actually show any aspect of the collection that they have. And then just wondering, so many museums, like I'm thinking of MoMA or Canadian Center for Architecture, like the role then of the indices and the online, you know, just how something is then accessible as a proxy for the actual piece, and sometimes, right, or in its digital mode. And I think that might, you know, I don't know if that would, if NFTs would come under the same kind of, you know, accessing, you know, accession number and all of these kind of motifs and modes in which museums actually classify the objects that they have or the artworks that they have, and then how they're accessible or understood. And I just think it's it's fascinating project, you know, and who moves and how much of it's automated, and is there a moment of, you know, perception that has to then, you know, there may be something that you claim a stake of, you know, somehow the work doesn't exist, you know, exists as commodity, but doesn't exist as art unless it's interacted with, or I don't know, I mean, just throwing that out, but I think your project kind of gets at a lot of that. So it's really, really fascinating, and I appreciate it. And thank you for sharing it.
Thank you very much.
If we have a minute, I was about 10 years ago, I was finishing a book on prisons and museums. And one of the odd tendencies of the early 2000s I ran into was a subterranean move in both building types, that there were a lot of A lot of the black site prisons were effectively underground, or at least in a kind of geographical no man's land. And a lot of art was beginning, actually, oddly, the two instances of art being taken underground at mid-century are Mies van der Rohe's National Gallery, which has the enormous glass gallery on top, but most of the gallery space in a plinth below. And then Philip Johnson's Picture Gallery, which is also this kind of bunker with enormous Rolodex for the paintings. And then you get to the Schaulager and a whole bunch of new media museums that went underground precisely to get gray room conditions, to get away from daylight, so that you could see new media work, which may or may not be a valuable precedent for the NTF, for that turn. But it just, for what it's worth, this century, like your proposal is, I think, well within the kind of typological state of the art for museums in this century. They're like, for whatever collection of reasons, people have really wanted to take art underground and figure out how to deal with it there. And it's just not, to me, it's more of a riddle than something I have than I've really been able to sort out.
Yeah, maybe just one comment, again, too, if we also have the time. I mean, I think just the question, your premise of accessibility is important, even when we look at your proposal ultimately, and maybe about this kind of notion of the underground, what it reveals. But I mean, I'm not sure the overall design is all that accessible. No, and I mean that in all terms, right? And I think that's is a classic debate of the sort of exclusivity of the art world, the museum, et cetera. And I'm wondering, like, with those shapes and forms and the kind of concealing of the entry and all of that is like necessarily, aligned with your overall premise of a general accessibility to everyone. And I just think it's a comment to that, and like the way that you ultimately design it. I think the way that you reveal the storage and things is maybe perhaps slightly more successful, but I think that's just something to question. What is accessibility through the architecture, right? And what is inviting in a way to a general public that may not necessarily have the kind of inclination, right, to visit the museum. And I'm not so sure what the proposal that is such being so subtle in the way that one finds your way into it. If that's the most appropriate way to think about it.
I think I would like to comment on that. What I thought when designing, and actually when I had my conversations with GPT-2, was this idea that you don't know what's there in a darkened room, and this idea of non-exclusivity of an architectural piece, that basically when you walk in the space, you don't really get to access it right away. It's this very intimidating space, I would call it, but then it opens up to you in ways where you're not actually expecting it. For example, the actual stone opens up, or the storage behind. So I think that's what I was looking for in terms of accessibility, something that looks inaccessible and very rigid, but is actually open up to you and is speaking to you.
These are a really fascinating conversation and amazing points. And I just wanted to add one thing, that for all of the effort to kind of connect with AI, to deal with the unseen, to deal with the hidden, you actually gave us a highly authored, incredibly visible access to all aspects of the project in a way. And I think that's a kind of incredible turn of events, that you didn't keep it hidden and you didn't keep it from us. You actually shared it with us. So congratulations, and thank you so much, Christina. We wish you lots and lots of success and luck going forward. Happy graduation.
Thank you to everyone and all your comments. Thank you.
Great. Okay, thank you, everyone. And we have our final student for today, Jordan.
Hi, everyone. present or bring this up. Hi, my name is Jordan Shorman, and I'm excited to share with you my thesis titled Woodwork, a New Architectural Interface. For me, this project really started with asking questions like, what is the working space of the architect? What tools are used? And what are some areas architects could begin to have more agency in? And then asking questions like, how could these changes begin to take on problems our current ways of working aren't equipped to deal with? To try and answer these questions, I first began with using Testa and Weiser's tweening platform, seen here, to make architectural elements like windows. As an initial exploration into different spaces architects could work. One issue that emerged was how architectural elements are actually sourced, fabricated, or produced. And I began looking at ways how this could be explored. For example, could it be a new type of factory? An exhibition, a website, or some sort of digital simulation of a workshop. One thing I found was that the interface and design space itself has a huge potential to answer my questions. Rather than using the ubiquitous grid interface as a tool for modeling, rendering, or selling images to clients, the computational power could be used to make us more informed about the choices we make and the consequences of these choices. For my thesis, I became interested in creating a digital workspace or an interface that helps rethink how architecture is produced. My interface focused on these 4 areas: the digital workshop, along with the extraction, manufacturing, and construction spaces. Unknown to the architect, each component or system chosen by the architect sets in motion a complex yet nebulous network of labor, extraction, manufacturing, and transportation. The working space of the architect could expand to become more conscious about ideas around labor, the sequence of production, how things could be made more ecologically, and consider the broader implications of what it needs to build. To enter into spaces beyond the design studio to address the often unseen, far-reaching consequences of architecture. When I was looking at current environmental interfaces, I found that architecture's consequences mostly are just measured through energy performance and carbon impact. BIM plugins like one-click lifecycle assessment, which is seen here, quantify the embodied carbon of a building by including material sourcing information in the end-of-life management process. However, I found it reduces an architect's role to mitigating carbon emissions and narrows the scope of architectural interventions. So in the digital workspace, my thesis is an attempt to develop a platform that goes beyond thinking of sustainability as just a measurement of carbon. Instead, one that accounts for the complex networks and externalities produced by architecture. In the workshop here becomes a digital factory in which an architect can see the design, fabrication, and production of architectural elements to better understand the fabrication and on-site labor, tools, and materials involved. It plays between model, construction, and documentation to create a space that moves design away from the contextless CAD screens and into a new digital space. For this, I chose lightweight wood construction for the elements being fabricated in the digital workshop. While many different materials are part of the construction process, this demonstration will focus on wood. This open-ended, flexible way of fabrication provides a method that is conducive to experimentation, readily available, and can be produced sustainable. In the extraction space seen here becomes a more participatory space that replicates the environmental and labor ramifications embedded in the sourcing of wood materials, but not visible in current architectural software. Currently, architects choose wood based on economics, aesthetics, or a vague sense of sustainability. However, this space allows designers and clients to make decisions based on previously hidden consequences by making evident the direct result of their actions beyond just the measurement of carbon. Things like source location, extraction system, the type of chemicals used, types of equipment, and new infrastructure like the construction of access roads are able to be simulated and visualized along with their consequences. The manufacturing process is another space architects can be more ambitious. This interface allows users to further select materials based on the equipment involved, energy usage and physical changes made to the environment. The architect and client become stakeholders in the source community and reduce the sense of abstraction that separates producers of architecture from environmental damages. I use this interface to construct a single family home detailed in the Office of Uncertainty Research exhibit, A House Deconstructed, and how it might change with this interface. The exhibit traces the sources, materials, and labor to educate architects about issues deeply embedded in the architectural process, yet rarely acknowledged. Here I use my digital workspace to demonstrate the impacts of site selection, labor sources, tools, building circularity, and construction assembly to augment the construction process. Using this information in the sourcing information from the House Deconstructed project, I was able to see how it could start to change designs. By looking at each material source, I could then start to identify and visualize the consequences from materials from the most problematic sources, like exploitative labor conditions or unsustainable or destructive sources. In this example, wood from Indonesia, Germany, and Brazil was found to be from degraded or unsustainable forests. And things like carbon dioxide and intense concrete were able to be removed. These are some of the first steps I've taken, but in the future, I like to further develop additional materials, their processes, and construction system to better address the complexity inherent in architecture. Today, architecture firms are starting to develop their own proprietary software, but there's an opportunity for new business models to include new ways of working, seeing, and valuing to address previously unseen areas. Architects have the opportunity to reclaim relevance by advocating for new ways of building that incorporates externalities of architecture. An expanded role of the architect not only needs new ways of thinking, but of working too. And by using this interface that brings things closer, you invite designers to factor in the consequences of building a certain way to help visualize and enter the space that is unseen. Thank you.
Hey, Jordan. I'm still kind of wrapping my head around your proposal here, but I'm wondering, have you by any chance heard of there's a installation right now in New York at the D of Chelsea by Lucy Ravens, and it follows the production of it basically follows the production of a concrete barrier from from mining through all the stages of production to the barrier of the actual concrete poured barrier at the end. But it's an incredible, it's a 20-25 minute film. And it's incredibly shot. It looks like passages of Fritz Lang's Metropolis. A lot of the time you're unsure what you're seeing until she pulls back or kind of tips the hand of her establishing shots. And I bring it up in part because, I mean, it clearly yours is a thesis with an almost incontestable ethical foundation to it. Like, none of us can tell you let me put it in the positive. All of us should be encouraging many more thesis projects like this that take on the building industry and its excesses and misguidedness in as many ways as possible, for sure. There, your project is sort of unassailable in in that sense. So then I think the question becomes how does it become most effective, and how do we help you as critics kind of sharpen your game and your outreach and your kind of positioning as you leave school and decide where to take a project like this. And I bring up Raven's project in part because I'm reasonably confident your ambition isn't to end up an artist in a New York gallery, but it's sort of remarkable what decisions she made to arrive at that end game. And I think some of the decisions she made could fortify the case you're making here. I'm won over by your argument, but in terms of how the rhetoric and the visuals relate, for example, I don't know how easy it would have been to document the differences in sourcing wood in problematic locations from those sourced in more sustainable ones. But even some indication of how that differential plays out in the landscape, how for example, how deforestation works in 30 seconds or less, or like I just think there are ways to make I guess what I'm wondering about, and I'm not sure it's good advice, but my first question as you finished was, how much inconvenient truth should there be to this thesis presentation? And I'm not sure where the answer is, but I think maybe a little bit more than you've given us.
Yeah, that is something I thought about, just because this process is so complex and there are so many things. So like what exactly should be shown, or what needs to be shown, was kind of something that I kind of struggled with to pick out everything in like 2 or 3 minutes. So yeah, that was like a challenge I dealt with.
Yeah, I think the project obviously is really current in terms of the discussion of designing platforms, sort of moving from, I guess, designing objects, designing algorithms, but then designing platforms that have an agency in terms of what they kind of reveal and enable in the design process. And I think, to me, there's something really nice about how literal some of these scenes are, because I think there's a lot of play that you're doing in terms of the kind of the legibility of some of these things. And I guess that kind of comes from, your analysis of the fact that maybe some of this information is there, but the way that it's presented is not necessarily always kind of clear and always visually demonstrated. And I guess for me, there's something really interesting about that connects to the game-like aesthetic of the project as well, and the fact that games are often, founded on taking maybe complicated source systems from reality, whether it's like simulating a city or nature or something like that, and breaking it down, sometimes still quite complicated, but in a less complicated fashion. There's a kind of level of abstraction that goes into the creation of those worlds. And so I guess one of my questions would be, that you're very in doing this, you're also very what's the word I'm looking for, you're very kind of honest, or maybe earnest, in the way that you're representing all of these things. And so for me, there's a kind of interesting question about, if you're going to the point of visually kind of evoking and visually demonstrating all of these decisions, is there a way that you as the platform designer can make let's say the right decision or the best decision somehow more visually, or more kind of, is there a hierarchy in there, because you're displaying things as being so kind of just so, in terms of this is what the actual thing is? There could be something certainly in the interface and the kind of platform design that emphasizes, I suppose, by making these kind of visualizations of this process. I guess it's, for me, it kind of made me think of, there's a book called Playing Nature by a game designer and an academic called Alenda Chang, where she talks about how nature's like simulated in games, and how let's say there's certain fast and loose ways in which nature is treated in games, because it's this kind of thing that can, it can never be ruined in the same way as reality. It can start again. You can restart the world, and it's not cut on this trajectory. But also, she talks a lot about this kind of the whole industry where people are like scanning in natural things to make them for game worlds and stuff like that. And it just made me think about the agency of the natural world in your game as well, and whether it might become less realistic at certain points in order to emphasize the argument that you want to make, you know, that there's this sort of space for being making it more of a caricature of something in order to sort of drive the point home. And I think there could, you know, for me, there's something interesting there because you've decided to take such a kind of visual language. I mean, I guess it made me think of the example, obviously, that you put in your presentation where you use a Dymaxion map to show the world as well, which in itself is obviously the map as a way of drawing the world in a very different fashion to other ways of mapping the world. You know, the act of drawing that map it says something through representing that information in a different way, because you obviously turn it into the kind of one archipelago of the world rather than these separated kind of continents in a sense. So yeah, I think for me, I really like the kind of idea and ideals behind the project. I think it's kind of interesting to think about how probably in a way, if you're making this as a platform, you'd also be testing it, wouldn't it? Which would come into these kind of questions of legibility and the visual communication and how things might need to kind of expand off, make things maybe more strange or more visually kind of differentiated in order to emphasize some of the points that you're trying to make.
I have a question for you, Jordan, regarding this idea of the platform. You know, I think what you're showing is really fantastically interesting visually, but to me there is a question and kind of the fundamental, let's say, philosophical difference between simulation and compositing. I think a simulation would be something which works, right? A piece of software that you can actually use, and it's responsive, and it's, you know, buttons are semantically related to the world that it's represented. And a composite is something which kind of looks like software, but it's actually made out of different things, which are not in principle related to each other, right? Except through kind of pretending to be software. If you know, if you understand what I'm trying to ask you. So, what is this? Yeah, can you tell us?
This is a composite of a fake software. So, like in reality, yeah, it would be like an actual software where it's responsive.
Jordan, the reason why I'm asking you, I kind of knew that, right?
Yeah.
The reason why I'm asking, I wish we had software like this. This looks incredible. Yeah, but it's really it's amazing to see just the level of kind of resolution and detail that you're proposing. I would just say, just as someone who makes software, I think it's a different logic when you have to deal with the constraints of a real simulation environment, right? And I would just encourage this thinking that you have to kind of enter into that world as well, because I think you have a lot to kind of contribute to that discussion, right?
That'd be the ultimate goal. Like next steps is to actually do that, which would be exciting to do, and I think would be really fun. And would open up a whole different like set of like spaces and questions I have to deal with.
Yeah, fantastic work. Really fantastic.
I think, you know, what you know, too, what could be really interesting with this is, one, what perhaps could be useful is the kind of simple like diagram of the process in a way. And if there is a kind of notion of feedback and perhaps like creating space within it for, you know, when there's a shift from applying a kind of notion of materiality and things to a kind of given design, a kind of preconceived design, to where the feedback of what the software is giving you then produces a kind of opportunity to sort of reinvent what the project is, right? In a way that either that it's, whether it's more efficient, more sustainable, whatever that might be, right? Because in a way it is right now it kind of assumes a project, and then you apply the kind of known project through this kind of interface, right, with different material choices or construction choices. So I'm just wondering, there's an opportunity in it to where that kind of notion of innovation can occur, right, where that feedback allows that to open that up. And I wonder if you thought about that in a way of it of being less about a tool to test material and construction type to where it actually would invent maybe new form.
Yeah, I think that was definitely one of the goals, or like one of the future steps I was interested in this project was. So like actually using this interfaces or the principles of this interfaces to see actually how it would change architecture, because environmental architecture now is pretty inert. So
yeah,
like the rules, and so like maybe see how this would actually like start to change things.
Yeah, I think that'd be great. I mean, I also think like in many cases, right, what happens is that it doesn't become a kind of single system, right? It actually, most are going to be hybrids systems, right, in that kind of construction type or material type, you know, and I know that becomes even more complex, but therein lies the kind of interesting component, right, where the kind of a hybridity of the form, but then also the constraints and the parameters of which the interface can create would then open up all those kind of possibilities that maybe the architect didn't see, right? Yeah, I think it's fantastic as an idea.
Yeah, I think that's a really kind of fascinating critique or a bit of feedback, Jeff. And I think part of the reason I think that is that it seems to me that there's the relationship of the building to, let's call it the process of shopping, where you can call it material sourcing. And in essence, there's a set of materials that are purchased, which are perhaps varying degrees of sustainability. But then there's the relationship of that building form to its environment. And of course, the sourcing of the material has big impacts, but it's in a moment. And then the impact of the building over time as a kind of entity or agent that's consuming energy, et cetera, might last 100 years or more. And so I think the realm of building form and the relationship of the, let's say, material to type, to typology is the area where we can really innovate. And the sourcing is undeniably important. It's also an area where forces beyond our control put their hands and fingers in, and the forces of economics prevail, as you can see with something as laughable as LEED, where it's really a system that's driven by commerce almost entirely. And so I think that's an area where we can really have a really strong impact.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I really love the project because I think you're also raising the question a little bit where we are as architects in the future, or where we should take authorship, you know, what we leave up to usually, I don't know, construction companies or so, right? And the question of why would someone hire you to design anything anymore? Because if you go to, I don't know, a construction firm, you can make basically your own plan, right? Based on really easy, accessible software. So I think there's something really, really exciting here. And I mean, I agree that maybe the form part that could be maybe thought through a little more and maybe offered exactly that like difference, right, between what is already out there again by construction firms and like as by you as an architect, and what that could entail. I think the whole and this is not at all my expertise, but I also find it interesting when you think of gray energy awareness. Like, how can you actually make people aware of what it means to, in terms of not only the material itself being sustainable, but also the production of the material and what that means, right, in terms of like I don't know, delivery time and so on. So I mean, I think there's so much really great questions and good thoughts here. So I really want to congratulate you on your project. I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, what I'm going to say probably going to sound repetitive, what others have already mentioned, but I do find the product really commendable. the kind of ethos behind the stuff that we use to build architecture, materiality, how it's sourced, how it's managed, how it's delivered. I'm thinking from the point of view that this will become your obsession after school as well, Jordan, and that, as Damien said, I think will be the goal to make this thing, a real platform. Obviously it would work, and I don't understand that that's probably a ton of work, but I think that should be your goal. I'm thinking of all the things that maybe stayed in the rear view mirror and didn't make it on time to be part of the thesis. But I'm thinking of the kind of byproducts that come of materials, right? That don't end up in the actual building. Those things also produce their own footprint, produce there's a kind of a second world of materiality that doesn't end up in the building itself, in the longevity of the building itself, and become something important, or the kind of waste associated with certain material, right? Like, how do we process what is unusable as a byproduct and becomes a certain kind of waste? How does that hold its own currency, and what kind of cycle does it produce? What kind of circuits does it need to go through, and how does that impact the certain adoptions of materiality, right? And I see this, I could see this platform as having like multiple types of materials, and kind of educating the architect and the designer to produce sensible solutions that have a certain kind of impact, have a certain kind of footprint, has a certain kind of longevity and whatnot in a way. But I think what you open up here is fascinating. And unlike a lot of these platforms that we've seen, this one is actually pretty, and it's very, it's something that you really want to get your hands on, at least for what we can see now. So I think that's a huge endeavor, and something that's really commendable. So.
That's a great. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jordan.
Oh, I was just going to say, like, in terms of the waste, that was actually a conversation I think, or something that Devin brought up, was like, what if you could only use offcuts? Like, how would that change the design? So that was kind of like one of those offshoots we were thinking about, like, as a next step of how this would actually change the design of like more sustainable architecture. But yeah, just didn't make it into the.
No, these are really great questions. And at first, I just want to congratulate you, Jordan. You pulled it all together. It looked amazing. And I think you really raised a super important conversation, and you did it aesthetically and not just like in a PowerPoint or something. So fantastic work today, and well, through the whole semester. But what I just want to pick up on that Maxi was mentioning is that I think that there's so much space for especially this generation of designers to engage these questions. I like how Luke kind of like phrased it. We went from designing the building, designing the algorithm, designing the platform. Like, that's kind of where we are now. And that the moment that I think Jordan is entering is graduating and entering the profession, we really need people like him and other of his classmates to try to not only deal with, this is kind of like the sourcing side. I've also been secretly dealing with the what happens after the building is built, what I've been jokingly calling BAM, building aftermarket. And so I think that, we've got like, this is building before, and then we have the building itself and all the maintenance. And then we have what happens afterward, that we know that our field is just full of, all kinds of problems in terms of construction waste, and ecological, we're just really not wide awake yet, I think, about the kind of ecological concerns that many of these other companies, like fashion companies and so forth, have around issues like upcycling. So I'm so happy that Jordan was able to kind of reach everyone with this, because I think maybe just as a first step, even just communicating and having a discussion and just putting that on the table is super valuable. And I think you did it really, really beautifully and on time. That's an inside joke that only Jordan and I understand. But anyway, fantastic. Thank you everyone for your comments today. And thanks, Jordan, for sharing the work. Congratulations.
Well, we still have 10 minutes, So if anyone has...
Oh, I thought we were wrapping.
Yeah, that's good to wrap.
Well, maybe I could just also really thank our guests today. This is fantastic kickstart to the grad thesis at SCI-Arc. I am so delighted to meet many of you. I've either read your papers or seen your work, and now I feel like I know you a little bit more. So thank you. It's been such a treat to have you share your comments and be so kind of engaged in the discussion with all of our students here. We really appreciate your time and care with the work and the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Congrats to all the students.
Great way to spend the
congratulations.
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 I also have to say that we are expected to be in the spin room after we finish here. And I'm not sure if you got the email from John Cooper about this, but this is, I think.
Do you have the link there, Damian?
We're staying in our...
Oh, staying here. Oh, well, why don't we give you a little bit of time to...
Yeah, we should make a break now.
Grab a drink or something and celebrate. Congratulations to all the students. Well done. Happy graduation.
Awesome.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. And let's come back at 5:45 for the spin.
Awesome. Thanks, Damian, for hosting.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Thanks.